Now to the first ever debate hosted by Uncensored America with Elijah Schaffer and Destiny, aka Stephen Bunnell. The second, are you guys excited for this? Yeah? I know we kind of made a bit of a stir last semester, so how many people know us from last semester, the Milo event? About most people here are cool. And what did you guys think of that event? Did you like it? We loved it. We had a great time with it. It was a lot of fun. And now we're doing a debate. Since we did one speaking event, we thought it'd be a great new event to have as a debate. So we're going to have Elijah and Destiny debate the biggest topic that we're having right now in world history, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. And we're going to have probably opinions that you see that you don't like, that make you uncomfortable, that make you think a bit, that maybe you agree with, maybe you don't, partially or fully. And that's the whole point of what we're doing here. We are a free speech organization that's not just focusing on saying we're for free speech, but actually practicing it. Actually having people with different opinions come out and share them with everyone. So we hope you have a great time and you enjoy this. It should be an interesting discussion. We're going to have a Q&A after the debate that will form right here. And we'll help instruct people for that when we do it. But you can ask whatever you want. Try to keep it on topic. If not, that's okay. Again, we're free speech. Anything goes. So if anybody here has been following us, you would have seen that we've been expanding, and we are now at the University of Tennessee. If you want to find out more about our clubs and anything else with our chapters, you can scan that QR code. You can follow us on social media, and you can also check out all the other cool stuff we have coming up. And with our second chapter, we were very lucky to have a second event with it. Elijah and Destiny were both very nice and very kind and generous to do two with us. Even though we're a new organization, they were more than happy to do it. So if anybody's going down south, we have a transgender debate that'll be happening at the University of Tennessee next week, exactly 1 week from today, on Wednesday, May 4th, Star Wars Day. And if you want to come down, it's the same sort of ticketing system as this, and at the same time as well. So if anybody's interested in that, you can go to our website, uncensoredamerica.us, to check that out. Now, back to the topic at hand here of Ukraine. It's a very divisive topic, the Russia-Ukraine war, but we're hoping really for people to get out of this is a more open mind on the issue. If you watch any news channel, it really doesn't matter if it's American news, foreign news, CNN, Fox News, fake news, real news. It's all just very simple. It's Russia bad, Ukraine good, or Putin is a great nationalist and Ukraine is acting out of self-defense. It's just very black and white, and there's not much nuance into it. So what we're trying to do today is have some nuance, have some interesting conversation that, and try to clear the fog of war. I mean, every day there's a new story that comes out about it that gets debunked just instantly. We had the Ghost of Kiev. Does anybody remember that? Yeah, that was Sam Hyde, right? Did y'all see that? He's a comedian, internet meme, and people are sharing fake pictures around it. Now, I bring that up because, yeah, it's kind of funny, but it just shows how much misinformation, propaganda is being spread by all sides. It doesn't really matter. It's America, Ukraine, Russia, and we have two very knowledgeable speakers who know the subject very well, and so they're going to help us really clarify what's really going on there. So it's not a black or white issue, and we're hoping to add some gray nuance to it. Now, our first speaker slash debater is a guy who's more right-wing. He famously got beaten up by Black Lives Matter in Philadelphia, and he's also a federally credentialed reporter that works for Blaze TV. He hosts two great shows, Slightly Offensive and You Are Here. And then our other speaker and debater is Stephen Bunnell, aka Destiny. He used to have a Twitch account, doesn't anymore. He's been banned and was banned on Twitter too. So he is perfectly in line with coming here for Uncensored America. And he's very famous in the Twitch realm or the YouTube realm for basically creating this whole genre that we see of the debate bro types, as some people call it, but just really debating on the internet. And he does a really great job at it. And I think anybody, no matter what your political alignment is, can see that he's very smart and knowledgeable on it. So please, everybody, welcome Elijah Schaffer and Destiny. I am going to be moderating this debate, but you probably won't hear hardly any of me, which is good, because we're just going to have our two debaters go at it and see where things go. I don't really like structured debates. I know a lot of people really don't either. So we're going to go for a more conversational approach where people are just saying what they think and coming up with whatever goes. If there's something interesting that we can pivot to, we'll try to do that. But we will first start with opening statements. And since Elijah is in the affirmative argument here, we will start with him, and I go to Destiny.
All right, how are you doing, Penn State? Doing all right? All right. You know, we were trying to figure out why a lot of the signs got ripped down for this event, if it was myself or Destiny, and we realized it actually says Ukraine is evil on the top, which is probably not a popular statement considering I see Ukraine flags around the sides, but for those of you that don't know me, my name is Elijah Schaffer. I'm a host on Blaze TV, and thank you for introducing me as the guy who got beat up at gunpoint by Black Lives Matter. What a nice group of people, right? Amen. So that's who I am, and apparently that's what my claim to fame is, but here's my opening statement. So, Ukraine is evil is the topic of tonight, and my point in being here is not to defend Russia. I think people get into this diabolical side where you feel like you have to choose whether you're for Zelensky or you're for Putin, when in fact the true victims of this world really are the people in it, while the governments war against each other, including those a part of NATO, those a part of Ukraine, and those in Russia. I have no means to try to defend Putin as being a good man, nor as a dictator or an autocrat. I don't think as an authoritarian there's any grounds to say that Putin himself is good, besides the fact perhaps of holding the Russian Federation together in times of turmoil, an election that of course he fixes every single time. But the truth of the matter here is to understand why Ukraine is evil and not its people. There is no means to say that the people have done anything wrong in and of themselves. But we will find that bad faith actors have been around since 1949. Around the time when NATO was formed, you had the initial states, including the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, etc., Netherlands, Belgium. You had the formation of a new military alliance between neo-socialist and, of course, neo-capitalist countries that saw the greatest threat to their own freedom, which was the USSR. Of course, you have Stalin at this time, ends up being superseded by Khrushchev and different leaders, but communism universally was seen as a threat to Western democracy, to our republics, and to our strength. And so the alliances were made. Of course, as you move forward to 1952 and you develop that Turkey joins NATO, you now have a direct competitor to communist power on the southern part of the Black Sea. This is seen as a threat to their well-being. I'm no fan of a communist country. I'm no fan of the USSR. And I think we can agree that the USSR overall was bad, though some, by the looks of it in here, probably would disagree with that. Ultimately speaking, as you move ahead, the USSR now feels flanked. So universally, in 1955, making the Warsaw Pact with some of the Baltic states, like Lithuania and Latvia, Estonia, etc., including with Ukraine, they create this new paramilitary pact of peace to try to prevent further NATO expansion of their power, and also to defend their own ability to have their own border and their own sovereignty. As an American, as a patriot, I'm not a big fan of these people, but I understand the need for nations to pick a side and to find allies in their fight. As we move ahead for decades, including the fight between East and West Germany, there's overall relative stability. But of course, with the collapse of the USSR in the early 1990s, and in 1992, with many of the previous Baltic Warsaw states, including like the aforementioned, joining NATO, joining the pact, we find that there is a move of Western power towards the East. During this time, the USSR has fallen into complete disarray. Russia is run by mobsters, and in fact, this is where the Russians have become true victims of a fallen empire and are being led by people who do not have their best interests in mind. You go forward to 1999, and you have countries like Poland, Romania, and Czech all joining NATO, or at least in some form of alliance, becoming a neutral or partner state, thus increasing the reach and the power of the country and isolating Russia further and further despite the Iron Curtain falling. By 2002, 2003, you have many of the other countries joining NATO, and you have Ukraine becoming what is up for a partner state. They're not part of NATO, they're not joining it, but they are universally seen as the borderland, the Ukraine, right? That's what it's called. And they are seen as a strategic pond between then Russia and now the West. Go forward to 2004 with the color revolution, you have the orange revolution, and you go forward, you see that a Russian government is definitely installed, some say through corruption. There's not many deaths in the revolution, but there's about a decade of discontent before there is a coup. In 2014, then Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Priyat, the ambassador to Ukraine, are bugged on a cell phone call showing and proving by the BBC that they planned on installing a US and EU-friendly government. This coup, or this backing, of course, with their new leader, people disagree on this, ends up creating a problem in Ukraine, a divide, a civil war between the eastern Donbass region, specifically Donetsk, and Luhansk, however you want to say it. I'm not Ukrainian, but someone can correct me. As this goes on and this continues, the Minsk II agreement is brought together primarily with France and with Germany, which creates a ceasefire on certain preconditions, 13 exact points, one of which being the ceasefire is that military equipment and therefore military powers of foreign intervention would be and leave the area. If you fast forward in 2020, BBC was already reporting that Russia was upset that the Minsk agreement was being ignored by the West. There was artillery shelling. Over 14,000 individuals were killed in the Russian-held territories. They were already voting in Russian elections. 220,000 of them were given passports and citizenship. And yes, in 2020, whether it was free, fair, or not, did elect Putin to be the continued leader of Russia, a democratic republic that was ruled. The Minsk agreement gave them their special elections. To fast forward here in a second, as you go over the next few decades, Putin gave 2 articles and 2 drafts to the West saying that they needed to stop with their military intervention, respect the Minsk agreement. This was UN Security Council Resolution 2202. Now, just 1 week before Russia invaded, having a failed internet Zoom talk, as you know how well those all go, with President Biden in 2021, in 2022, a week before he invaded, he sat at the Security Council, not Putin, but the ambassador from Russia, and talked about the Minsk agreement not being looked at and not being respected in terms of military aid and equipment, which both Biden admitted to in 2020, and we saw with the quid pro quo with President Trump being admitted that we were giving them aid, not respecting the ceasefire and the lack of equipment and aid. As that progressed, France and Germany, who held the responsibility to see peace between Ukraine and Russia, sat back and did not intervene. And Ukraine, with the puppet government who's currently in place, and after Poroshenko was removed, and you had Zelensky who's now in power, they sat there, they ignored the Minsk II agreement, and all of a sudden they wonder, as Kiev was being at least alleged to uphold and to be storing up military equipment so that they could do an offensive into the Donbass region, it appears, though, that Putin and himself, looking at a strategic military disadvantage, decided then to push in his quote, to liberate or to take back the land that already voted republicly for his power, and therefore sent his military into the land. Of course, things have escalated, and I'll end on this. For people to say that then, therefore, I'm not saying that Russia is good, but, that Ukraine is evil, well, here's the problem. Just yesterday, the UK Secretary of Defense admitted that American weapons and Western weapons, including from the UK, are being used, including Javelins and Stinger missiles, to launch attacks across the Ukraine border into the Russian mainland. This has escalated the tensions, and Putin is therefore saying that the United States and foreign governments, including all of NATO, if this was truly a war about Ukrainian independence, why would they be launching an offensive into Russian territory? And it is therefore seen through strategy and corruption that Ukraine in and of itself is a puppet state through a successful coup through NATO and the United States in 2014, and the government that is currently in charge does not have the interests of its people, and the Galatians from southern Poland and other interest groups have created propaganda to make them think that they could, in fact, be a part of NATO without serious military intervention. And with the 8 million refugees we see today, we now realize that Ukrainians are the true victims, that the puppet government in place is looking out for the will of the United States government, and even NATO kind of disagrees and the EU disagrees. But again, once again, this is another proxy war the United States has caused. Many people are dying, billions of dollars are being wasted, and we are only allowed to see propaganda from one side. So yes, I do believe the state of Ukraine is evil at the hands of the American regime, which is hard for me to say this, which I believe is also evil. Thank you.
All right, hello. Okay, my name is Stephen Bunnell. That was the short opening statement by Elijah. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the back and forth. I think that when you look at the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, I think that a very simple-minded person will look at the conflict and they'll think, this is pretty easy. It looks like there's clearly a bad guy. It looks like there's clearly a good guy. Once you start digging into things more, I think you run into weird areas. Was the 2014 revolution, was that a foreign-backed coup? Is it okay that Western powers or NATO has interest in Ukraine? Does Russia have a right to securing land that ensures that they feel that their country is safe from foreign invaders? It gets a little bit more complicated. But I think as you dive further and further into it, it becomes pretty simple once again. In '91, Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union. That country, that included Crimea, was respected. Its independence was respected across the entire world. Whatever reasons you feel like Russia might have for shoring up security on their borders does not justify an invasion into the country of Ukraine. It has been a long time, it has been decades since another country has invaded another sovereign state and stolen territory for the purpose of controlling it permanently for another country. Russia is rewriting the rules for how security works across Europe and across the world when it engages in acts like this. There is no hypothetical phone call between Nuland or anybody else. There is no hypothetical security concern. There is no hypothetical concern with NATO that could justify the action of Russia to invade Ukraine and do this, although I suppose we'll get into the specifics in our debate. I believe that it is okay for the West to be helping Ukraine in all but military force directly. We don't want Russian troops shooting at NATO troops ever. That's something that we've avoided for the most part for the history of NATO, and I think we should continue to avoid that. But to say that Russia has a right to invade and destroy the sovereignty of Ukraine because they have hypothetical security concerns, which in my opinion and most experts' opinions are not justified because NATO does not attack Russia. Russia does not fight NATO. I do not think there is any good justification for Russia invading Ukraine, and I imagine we'll hash that out.
Yeah, so a couple things you just said there. So I do have a couple questions for you before we go further. Do you believe the Donbass region, specifically Donetsk and Lugansk, right there, not even the entire region, west of, including Mariupol, but the eastern part that has been fighting, directly at the separatists, do you think that it is actually Ukrainian territory, or do you believe through their own elections, voting for Putin, that would be still considered a democratically or a republicized place that belongs to Russia? Do you believe that region belongs to Russia, or are you talking about, like, how do you define that?
The region clearly belongs to Ukraine. You can't just vote yourself out of a country. No other country on the planet would accept that.
But it is not just a vote. I mean, with the Minsk agreement, I mean, this is international. This was internationally recognized.
The Minsk agreement was not a guarantee that these would be separated states like Russia's tried with other countries in the past. The Minsk agreement was attempting to get a ceasefire, and that was broken on both sides, which is internationally recognized. It wasn't only Ukraine that was breaking on that. Fighting has been ravaging on there for the better part of the last decade.
Yeah, so my point is that, yes, it did recognize, because it did allow for even independent elections and self-governance. So when you have self-governance and you have states saying, we do not want to be a part, we do not believe the election was fair and free, which, by the way, in America, the only election that we have that was fair and free was 2020. 2016 was hacked by the Russians, and 2022 might be hacked too, but we know a little bit about that. But the people in Ukraine fully understood, or were under the impression that, yes, there was a disagreement because of the leaked call that took place from our own government, the United States, that they had the interest of seeing then Poroshenko, the then president of the country, being installed, and seeing the other Russian government, after he fled, right, to Kharkiv, once he left, I'm saying they saw this as being an illegitimate coup,
yeah,
and so they declared independence, and they separated themselves, and there was at least an acknowledgement that these regions would be governed differently.
No, so I encourage anybody to go and listen to the phone call with Nuland and the ambassador. That is not the case. Two diplomats talking on the phone expressing a preference or talking about what new leadership would look like does not make an organized coup. The idea that the 2014 revolution was some foreign-backed CIA, NSA, US, NATO-backed thing, it misunderstands the entire history of why those protests have been going on for so long. Ukraine was one of the most corrupt countries across all of Europe, if not the entire world. So there were plenty of good reasons for why that revolution was happening, why the protests were happening, and the revolution itself happened, the ousting happened, because police were shooting at protesters. You don't need any kind of foreign interference to see why he ran from the country. You don't need any foreign interference to see why the people felt like they needed a new leader there. And the idea that we would just accept a separated breakaway states in the east, like what Russia has already done with Georgia, with Abkhazia, and with South Ossetia, with what Russia has already done with Moldova, with Transnistria, that wouldn't be an acceptable outcome, any more than it is that they already invaded Crimea and stole that piece of land from Ukraine as well. You can't allow Russia to continue to go in to send their own, not even arms, but their own military, and then break off sections of Ukraine and say, oh, well, these are going to be independent breakaway states now, while we ship in our own military, our own arms, and our own passports, until eventually it looks just like every other breakaway state that Russia's created. That's just a total violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. There's no justification for it.
So it's interesting you bring up sovereignty, because it's funny when we talk about the fall of the Soviet Union that Ukraine had the ability to break away from the Soviet Federation. And so there is this level of understanding that people can, as a republic, as a democracy, a representation, decide how they themselves want to be governed. The United States is a pure example of that, breaking away from the British Kingdom and the fact that we wanted to be self-governed. So on this ability, even with Security Council 2202, the reason why France didn't acknowledge it, and the reason why the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN literally stood up there and said, said, we're not going to even acknowledge Minsk II because we don't want to legitimize the individual governance or the authorities, specifically in the Donbass region, towards Russia, because we see this to be as a threat to our sovereignty, which is true in and of itself. But that would be with the acceptance that Ukraine's government was through fair and free elections. And while you would say it is true, why is it that just 10 years earlier in 2004, there was mass protesting? Because the specifics were said because of corruption and severe election fraud were stated as the two main factors, or seven, but two main factors of why the 2004 election was considered to be defunct and why there had to be even a recall and a re-election, there had to be revoting, because they said that these elections were not reliable, that Ukraine was suffering deeply under a problematic influence from foreign governments, foreign actors, both Russia and the United States. So 10 years earlier, we have an entire problem of an election, but 2014, when there's clear signs that there's Western interventionism involved. And by the way, that's why I said I would not make the defense for Putin, because there's definitely Russian influence going on as well. You might say then that, yes, again, the Ukrainians aside, the government itself is a Western prop. This is an actual understanding. This was something that was pushed, perceived, to the point to where the current president literally had to flee, allegedly at gunfire, and had to be exiled. How does that sound like a peaceful transfer of power? How does that sound like a normal democratic election?
It's called a revolution. It wasn't a peaceful transfer of power at all. But again, when you start ordering your police to shoot at protesters, it's probably not going to be a very peaceful transition. I think that's pretty well understood. The idea that there was some sort of installation of a new government when the interim prime minister was literally the opposition majority party leader, it doesn't make sense to say that that was some guy that was installed, what, years before by the West or years before by NATO? They're just this conspiracy, this idea that there was some foreign backing to what was happening in Ukraine doesn't make sense. And when you go to 2004 and you say, well, people accuse those elections of being fraudulent too, that's different. That's not comparable to 2014, where Russia makes an accusation and then invades and steals land from Ukraine. Nobody, or at least unless I missed it, I don't recall France or Germany or any Western NATO country going in and stealing land from Ukraine because they were saying that the elections weren't fair and free. Usually when we say that happens, we just criticize the country and we kind of move on from it. We didn't steal anything from Belarus. We didn't go down to Venezuela or Bolivia or any of these other countries, or at least not the past 30 years, and try to steal land from them. So I don't think that the accusation that in 2004 we said the election wasn't fair and free, and then in 2014 Russia says it's not fair and free, these aren't comparable because we weren't moving in to steal land afterwards. This is rewriting the rules of how foreign affairs work. We just don't do this anymore.
So you don't believe that as the previous Warsaw nations are being brought into NATO, and you have this one disputed territory literally called the borderland right there, where there's a NATO expansion and an issue going on currently between Putin and Western powers trying to prevent that expansion in order to ease tensions that were going on. Obviously, obviously you know Putin's main priority, not just for Ukraine, was to annex Crimea because of the port on the Black Sea. We do know that. I mean, his military power there, as well as trade route, etc., is super vital and strategically important to him. You also do realize, which could be considered Russian propaganda, that at least he says, and I wouldn't take Putin's word very strongly, as I wouldn't take many world leaders today's word at face value. He claims to care a lot about the Russian people, the Russian Federation, of Belarus, of the Ukrainians. I mean, in World War II, you know this because the amount of troops they lost just defending Kiev, I mean, some of the troops they fought, they were a united people just recently. And if we even want to go back, I mean, back in World War II, obviously you said these countries would never take land. I mean, sometimes we live in the internet age where we think in just like the last several years, forgetting that Germany being a part of a Minsk II agreement to prevent land stealing is kind of ironic, considering it's barely been less than 100 years, and Germany's done a few things in the last 100 years, give or take, that are questionable.
We don't go back 100 years to see what foreign affairs look like now. I think we roughly look at the state of European security over the last 30 years, since the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, since NATO's mission is roughly to ensure a stable amount of security in Europe. When you say things like, well, we want to make sure that Ukraine doesn't join NATO because it causes tensions with Russia, what kind of tensions? Like, this is the question that always fascinates me. People are always like, well, Russia's worried to have NATO on its border. Why? They're already up on their border in 3 countries in the Baltics to the north, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, they're already on the border there. If we want to launch nuclear missiles, we don't even need to do it from there. Turkey already has nuclear missiles. Do we think that there's going to be a ground invasion into Russia from Ukraine? That's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen because NATO doesn't attack Russia. We literally have a hotline from Washington to Russia where we make a direct call and we say, hey, do you have troops there? Because if so, we're not going to go in. Like, we take a really big effort to avoid these types of confrontations. I just don't see what the possible tension is unless we're talking about Russia being able to move in their own military and either break away states or take over parts of other sovereign nations like they've done with Georgia and like they're doing now with Ukraine. What are they trying to avoid? What is the tension?
I mean, so the tension is quite obvious. So even if we go back, you do have to look back hundreds of years. It's very important, specifically Napoleonic Wars, even World War I and World War II, looking at strategic land groups, specifically flatlands that are used to grow wheat that are easily accessible and a type of soil that allows a fast strategic movement, including railways, to move large amounts of equipment and troops across a geographic landscape. And Ukraine does provide that and has been used in many past wars as an exact direct route to invade eastern lands. So there is that. I don't think you have to go back fully, which is again why there's no justification for Putin himself. I do believe that Putin, if indeed truly that the eastern regions did declare independence and did not want to be a part of Western ideals or values, that we have to respect, just like, I mean, I've worked in Shanghai, I've worked in South Korea. They're very distinct and unique countries that have their own culture, prospects, and national interests, just like the United States of America. And so as you move forward, obviously he might want to protect these people. Maybe it's propaganda. He goes in saying, hey, we are giving, I believe we gave, what, 1,400 artillery with 144,000 munitions that were used to kill, like I said, 14,000 approximate people across in those regions during a conflict of separatists, which we call separatists, but he calls duly elected or a republic that naturally elected him in an actual election in 2020. So when you have 220,000 of your own citizens that have been expedited and given passports and you're in this land, I'm wondering on an international level, this is why would there continue to be a continued resistance and a fight? What benefit did Western Ukraine have to continue to provoke Eastern Ukraine, and why did they propagandize their people? Why was there this push to join NATO to lie and make it seem like there was some international duplicate or some laissez-faire idea where you can create a new economy between Ukraine and Europe without intervention from Russia, because Russia said that Ukraine needed to stay neutral, that it could not receive, back in 2014, even before then, could not receive these foreign military aid, could not have the equipment put in place, and it's like we were living in La La Land telling Ukrainian people it was going to be cool. Now you have 8 million of them as refugees in neighboring countries because they had a dream that could not be realized.
There's no justification. Every way that you talk about Ukraine is like it has to be this subservient member state to Russia's greater world plans. Every single framing. Well, what if lands in the East maybe also to talk about an election held in 2020 when Russia has had troops on the ground there since 2014 is a bit comical. It's almost like referring to the Crimean Peninsula resolutions that happened after Russia took over and said you have two options. You can either join us or you can either remain independent and then join us. The idea that you can just move in and take over places because there might be some conflict there just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any more sense than if Southern California suddenly had a bunch of Mexican separatists there that wanted to break that away and have them join Mexico. The rest of the world wouldn't say, well, United States, you just have to kind of cede your sovereignty there and allow some of your states to break away and join Mexico. Of course not. We would hold on to that land because it's our sovereign territory. And since 1991, Ukraine has had distinct borders that have been recognized by not only the rest of the world, but Russia itself, and no amount of separatist movements, especially ones that are funded by Russia, allow them to break away and just join Russia. And then the reason why I don't like to go back historically is because when people want to go back historically, they only go back so far. You know, you hear Putin and you hear all these other people talk about, well, you know, the people in the East, you know, they feel Russian, they speak Russian, they've got a lot of Russian ethnic roots. Yeah, of course, that's because during events like the Holodomor, millions of Ukrainians were forcibly starved to death, their wheat was requisitioned, and people that were trying to flee towns were shot and murdered by Soviet troops. So after millions of people die and hundreds of thousands of Russians, ethnic Russians, are shipped in, which the Soviet Union did to all of their little republics that they had gotten as part of the Soviet Union, to go back into the past and then to come forward into the future and say, well, look, there's a lot of ethnic Russians there now, to say that a prior genocide can supersede the sovereign borders drawn around a country in 1991, and then we go forward to 2020 and say, well, look, there's a lot of ethnic Russians there. That's just absolutely bizarre to me. I think that when we frame the conversation, I think we have to stop saying, well, Russia's worried about this, so they should be able to invade, or Russia likes this, so they should be able to take that. Let's look at it from the Ukraine perspective. They have a country that was recognized internationally with borders since 1991. What right does Russia or any other country have to come in and steal territory from them? I haven't heard a single justification for that.
What year were you born?
What year are we on right now?
What year were you born, I said?
1988.
Okay, so you have a country that's borders were drawn, that's technically like younger than yourself in many ways, and so you have this and you act like this is how life always was and how it always will be. You're talking about already a country built out of the collapse of another country.
It was recognized.
I do not need to justify Russia coming in. I'm saying Russia, like all international sovereignties and powers, I look at an interesting interview from Condoleezza Rice. I don't know how you guys feel about her, but what an interesting war hawk. I don't know how we justified so many invasions invasions and so many wars recently. But I watched her on, I think it was MSNBC. She was being asked about how can a large superpower bully a smaller country and invade without UN Security Council clearance and bomb them. And she was like, I can't believe that people could do that.
You see the pivot here, though, right?
No, but what I'm saying is, I'm going, ma'am, we did that. The United States did that.
The United States has not, in the past 30 years, invaded a country and stolen their territory.
That's subjective. When you're literally,
it's not subjective.
When you're a universal global empire, when you're a universal global empire, you don't have to occupy the same way you do. I mean, we are still in Iraq, and we just pulled out of Afghanistan. I mean, you're talking about we were occupying for many, many years. So what's going on right now is that he has not stolen it. He said that he wants it to be neutralized. So his resolution, and I'm telling you this, he hasn't even won the war. So he has not won, he has not stolen it yet, but he has identified and he has recognized the eastern region to be a part of the Donbass, a part of Russia, based upon their own elections. Now, we could even argue whether those elections were fair and free. And again, I would actually argue probably in many of Ukraine's elections have been absolutely mired in election fraud. Anytime Putin's running for president again or running for the country, he'll win because the elections are completely rigged in his favor. This is very common internationally, especially in countries that have come out from the USSR, of mass corruption across their democratically elected governments. But I will say this. Yes, we are in the middle of a conflict. So when we're referencing like you cannot go in and steal land, we do not know if there's a ceasefire, if he would pull out his military. I'm telling you this genuinely.
He's already taken Crimea. In 2014, yes. That happened. You pointed out rightly, Sevastopol, you've got the port city, and he owns that peninsula now. You cannot have this incredibly naive notion that I can't believe you truly believe this, that like, oh, well, we're just recognizing like free and independent elections there. Like, this is the same thing in 2008 that happened with Georgia. You can't just go to a place and say, oh, well, we recognize that this is an independent state, and we're going to ship in our peacekeeper troops and have them there and break that state away and take it from you, and then now we're going to work with them. Like, even if you criticize the United States' entry into Iraq or Afghanistan, which I think there's plenty of criticism to go around, we didn't do that there. We didn't go into Iraq and say, we're going to break off Kurdistan, the Kurds have their own independent country now, or we're going to take Baghdad and some of these places, and we're going to break our own like independent state out, or in Afghanistan we're going to break away. Like, even with the U.S. involvement there, we didn't go that far. And you can't keep saying like, well, 100 years ago we did this, or 50 years ago we did that. The security of Europe and the entire world kind of rests on this idea that countries function and operate in certain predictable ways. One of those things is that countries don't march into other countries and steal territory or break it away. That's just that the state of security of the world is in jeopardy if we accept that as part of the new playbook going forward. It's even independent of Ukraine, even independent of what's happening there. The idea that countries can march in and just steal territory just rewrites so many of the rules that we've established post-collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so you're using very key words that I'd have to disagree with you on about the stealing of the land. We hear that here too, that we stole this land. But it is quite interesting. When there's a genuine political issue, there's an actual conflict, and like you even use the word revolutions, like particularly, which some people say would be inaccurate of what happened in 2014. It's very important to realize a revolution means literally a regime change or a change in power, a change in influence, change in direction of the country, difference, even in the Constitution. You rewrite everything. So we're talking about a country that you're saying, okay, gained independence, was internationally recognized in 1991. Where was it before 1991? Well, part of the USSR. Oh, well, things collapse, things change, and things declare independence, and it happened before, it happens again. You go ahead to 2014, this country is not this stable country that's been around for 700 years, and now suddenly there's just somebody marching in and saying, I'm stealing the Donbass region. No, there is an actual revolution that takes place with a disagreement between the Ukrainian people of who actually won and defining what Ukraine is. That's an important understanding. There is a Western identity of what we believe Ukraine is based on a Western understanding of what they want. But their country is split between two sides, actually by a border that supersedes even the regions or the provinces themselves. No, let me finish. This is important, and I know because as a progressive, progressives don't like to look too far back because it's always about the future, but in the moment and what's going on here, this is a problem. When a country has an own identity crisis and it wants to side not just in its own identity, but with two diametrically opposed superpowers that have a different vision, a different economy, a different function, even currency, that looks out for their future. Well, now that's what you call a civil war. It's important to realize that the civil war that's been going on in Ukraine never ended. The ceasefire that came apart heart was a ceasefire, and it was never truly respected. I mean, we could go off and talk about the Azov battalion, which is not as big as people think. I mean, some people say it's between 500 to 1,500 people. The terrorism that was going on in the eastern regions. I mean, this place has been mired in conflict. So talking about Ukraine's just this peaceful place, and he went in, no, it is a country that doesn't even define its own identity, can't even agree on its own government, and cannot even define who its allies are. So you're wondering, it's like us going, well, why is the US sending aid to Western Ukraine? Because that's the idea and identity of Ukraine that we acknowledge and believe is sovereign in of itself. But the eastern part has its own idea. Can we not understand that perhaps it's not to just blame Putin, but perhaps these people really do want independence, and they really do want to be a part of the Russian Federation, and they do not see themselves as Western Ukraine, but as the true Ukraine. And that's what I meant about the evilness of what is going on. The idea to not acknowledge the true depth of the divide between the people groups, with friends in Odessa, which is anecdotal, but I understand what's going on in some regard, with people even being confused on who's really a Ukrainian and who's a Russian. It is definitely a very contingent and a very sensitive topic, and I think it already behooves us to start saying, oh, Ukraine, as in we're defining the eastern people as what, not Ukraine? Are they Ukrainians?
I didn't expect I would be arguing with a conservative about the importance of borders, but this idea that...
I'm not a conservative.
This idea that Ukraine is a Western concept, or this idea that that's just fantastically incorrect. There's no basis in reality.
I didn't say that. I said the Western idea of what you think Ukraine is.
There is no Western idea of what we think Ukraine is. In 1991, the Republic of Ukraine declared itself an independent republic from the Soviet Union, and Russia recognized what Ukraine was in all of their borders. They didn't say, we recognize you until a civil war, or we recognize all of you except for the Donbas region, or we recognize all of you except for Crimea. If you really piss us off, you don't join our custom trade union. That was the country. It doesn't matter if there is conflict in a country. Just because there's conflict in a country doesn't invite another country to come in. You gave kind of like the childlike version, but the childlike version is actually what happened. In 2014, Putin was incredibly mad that his guy got ousted, and so they started backing hardcore some of the separatist fighting in the eastern part of the country because they saw an opportunity to move in and support a couple breakaway states, exactly the same thing they did in Georgia, and they did that on the back of invading and stealing Crimea from Ukraine. The idea of Ukraine is just a Western idea doesn't make any sense. There's just no bearing in reality for that. You acknowledge that in 1991, the entire world recognized the country of Ukraine.
I didn't say the idea of Ukraine is just a Western idea. I said there is a Western idea of what Ukraine is, and there is an Eastern idea of what Ukraine is.
You recognize that the whole world understood what Ukraine's borders were in 91, right?
Universally, yes.
Okay. A civil war in a country or some separatist fighting in a country does not give another country the right to come in and break away territory. You recognize that, right? If there was fighting in some part of New Mexico or Arizona or Texas, would Mexico have international authority or even the moral right to come into the United States and say, we're going to recognize Arizona as a breakaway state now? You're not allowed to have that anymore?
Oh, you're asking a question?
Yeah, that's a question.
So I think you're actually putting a weird parameter on here that I don't think is accurate, and this is where I think we're disagreeing predominantly, because again, you keep putting words in my mouth as if I'm saying Ukraine is a Western idea. No, there is a universal idea. This is what's so funny, is that it's 1991 is so not far in our past. And we look at 1991, you go, okay, there's a breakaway. It's not just Ukraine, but there's the fall of an empire. It's the fall of the USSR. Overall, some would argue it didn't really ever fall, but its power actually fell across the globe. So now you have all these new states who have this decision of what they can or cannot do, but there isn't peace in the world. It's not like Russia and NATO are suddenly friends. It's just that there's no centralized universal power that is communist that now has this grip on the world. So now you're in this strategic place, and I think that most of these countries right there, the Baltic countries and those in the borderlands, chose strategically to stay generally neutral. If you even look, it took several years until some of the even closer countries, like I said, like Poland, Romania, Czech, etc., to even join NATO, fearing of what might happen. Now, by 2020, almost every single country in the Warsaw Pact that was at one point allied with Russia or the Russian Federation, whatever you would call it, is now a part of NATO. These are two power groups that are diametrically opposed to each other. I don't know fully why. Sometimes I feel like most of the world's conflicts are self-invented and we could solve a lot if we weren't so stupid, but ultimately speaking, that's the way the world's been. So now you have this issue where there's one country, specifically Ukraine, the borderland, that is there, that is a partner state as of 2003, that remains a group that is neither with NATO nor directly is in relation with Russia. But they do have a good trade agreement going currently during that time, a very, very, very vibrant and progressive trade agreement with the Kremlin and with Russia and Moscow. So you have this problem. So you look at this, yes, in terms of now, and it wouldn't make sense, but if you look at it in the past, going forward, you see, okay, you could actually even accuse Russia of what I'm accusing the West of today. Perhaps the elections were actually fraudulent and were genuinely rigged, and you have this pro-Russian government put in place. Still, there's this sense of neutrality that is there. But over the years, as you've seen, the United States has continued to meddle, and I genuinely say this because if you look at transcripts of how much the EU has disagreed with the US's handling and push for Ukraine in terms of with aid, with military aid, with technology, to encourage them and to create a sort of, I would even say, disinformation, misinformation campaign through their media to make them feel like they were Western, a desire grew, like I said, with certain people groups and a hatred for Russia in the West. So before this revolution happens, there is this opposing feeling, there's an opposing viewpoint that I know was brewing for quite some time, because even as the revolution happened in 2014, I have a friend who I'm not going to mention his name, was talking about his nervousness of the split, with some areas it even being dangerous to speak Russian, some areas it being dangerous to speak Ukrainian. So you have, as we're all familiar with in the US, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's two political sides and they don't get along that well. Maybe you haven't watched. But you can see things blow up, like in 2020 on the racial justice movement in America. Things can happen. So you have this country that has an identity crisis. Then you have this 2014 revolution. We disagree on the fact that the US, while they said publicly that they wanted the Ukrainians to have the choice, we know they even had planned already. And I understand what you're saying with the transcript. They already had then Vice President Biden and whatnot already ready to give a remark and pro-Ukrainian government, their candidate at the time. They had pre-planned it. So it does look like we kind of knew something was going to go on, or we at least had interest that went against our public statements we were making at the UN. So we did lie at the UN Security Council. That is true, by saying that we just wanted the best interest. We didn't have a personal choice of who should win, when in reality the bugged conversation shows we did. So we are lying on the international stage, which already puts into question our influence. And then you have this war. It's not settled. Like I said, you go, oh, well, hey, he took away Crimea. Did he? Because really, like I said, the identity of Ukraine in itself never got solidified, so much to the point they could not end the war, and the war never ended. And one could say the invasion today is not an invasion, but a continuation of an identity crisis of a country who does not know who it really is.
I think the war was ending in the East, especially with the new drones that were being shipped in from Turkey. I think that was why the onus was on Putin to invade when he did, because they knew that those eastern regions were on their way to being settled. And once they were settled, I don't know if Ukraine turns its eyes to Crimea, or they just feel like they've lost all of the investment they've done in the East. Regardless of all of that, going back to the central question, because I notice this when I have these discussions, people will talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, but there's no justification for Russian invasion into Ukraine. For a simple question, let's say that Ukraine has a choice between joining a free trade agreement with Europe in order to open up their ability to access the European market more, or they have, what was on the table was an exclusive customs union with Russia and Belarus. Why does Ukraine not have the option to make that choice? Why are they not allowed to? Every time we talk about Ukraine, it's always through the framing of like, well, Russia would be uncomfortable. Oh, well, the West wants it. Why wouldn't Ukraine be allowed to make that decision?
Ukraine could, but Ukraine in of itself never settled its own civil war, and that's the problem. There is still a disagreement. I'm telling you this is true. There is a disagreement between the actual fairness of actually even legitimizing the people in the East do not acknowledge or even recognize the fact that the election...
It doesn't matter.
It does matter because
half of the United States doesn't recognize Biden as the rightful president right now. But that doesn't mean that the United States can't conduct, foreign affairs. It doesn't mean that the president, the executive, that we can't make treaties, that we can't do anything across the world, because there's a lot of people in our own country right now that don't think that our election was legitimate. You can't point to a small civil war in a region in Ukraine.
You want the justification?
Well, since that's happening,
you want the justification?
Yeah, what is the justification? Yeah.
I'm saying that depends on who you think is right. So there are people in the East do not believe that it was a fair and free election. They believe that it was rigged from the United States and from the EU, and that they have the evidence.
Okay, what is one other?
Let me finish this.
I got to, because this is justification. If somebody doesn't have a free and fair election, when does the West invade that country and then steal territory from them?
One would say that Ukraine already is the West. The Western Ukraine already is part of it. It was a partnership country as of 2003.
That's what you're saying is not a justification. Like you're giving me a lot of like true things that are happening, but there are people in Ukraine that are upset with how the leadership is going. There are people in the East that are even separatist movements that have Russian troops there and are also being Russia back. But there are legitimately people that are part of the East and people that were in Crimea that were more in favor of Russia. But that is not alone a justification for Russia to move in and take over.
Yes, because here's the problem. So the West did not even acknowledge the ceasefire or the lack there's the 13 points in there. I think we've already violated 8 of them over the course of 1 or less than a decade, 8 years, including, like I said, giving foreign military assistance to a government that the Eastern region and Western region in front of the UN Security Council, by the way, has agreed, like I said, through the resolution 2202, that there was an understanding of separate governance. That is not a whole country. If there is already an international acknowledgement, let me finish. If there is an international acknowledgement through ceasefire that there is independent governance, even with constitutional amendments and an understanding of what was going on in the East, that is not the end to a war or a country in and of itself that has a solid identity. No, let me finish. Because you mentioned the United States with Joe Biden. Look, it doesn't matter what anyone thinks about the 2020 election. When he was confirmed as president. So legally, whether you would argue how he got there, he is legally the president of the United States, and anyone who says otherwise is absolutely moronic, because he was confirmed as the president.
As was Ukraine's president after the interim government, and held new elections, right?
So understand this. However, that is not the case. We were not in the point of a revolution. Joe Biden was not a revolutionary change of regime of power. You had a Russian foreign government-supported government and a Western-supported government backing each other in a contentious battle for control of a certain territory that both did not want to concede to each other. This was not Democrats versus Republicans. This is an international regime change.
None of this is true.
Yes, it is.
Everything you just said is not true.
It is 100% true.
The difference,
debunk it.
The equivocating of what Russia does with what the United States. Oh, we both support the country because on one end there are a couple ambassadors talking to each other, and on the other end you've got actual military troops on the ground. You've got oligarchs that play radio stations constantly all over Crimea and in parts of Ukraine. The trying to say that both of these sides are acting the same is just absolutely unfathomable. And the idea that there might be some autonomous government in a region, therefore the whole country falls apart, doesn't make sense either. Crimea was ran with an autonomous government for a long time. Kurdistan in Iraq is ran with an autonomous government. There are plenty of countries all over the world that have autonomous regions that run kind of on their own, that work with the government. That doesn't mean that another country can just come in and steal the land. That's just not how global affairs work today. We can't settle for that.
Okay, so here's the point. So number one, I'm not defending saying what Putin's doing is good. I'm saying internationally with sovereignty, you have a problem. You have this line, you have the line written in, again, like I said, a ceasefire that was brought, and there's been no end to the conflict. Both sides, let me explain to you. Internationally, one side does not agree with the other side's conclusion. And in the country itself, they do not agree in and of themselves. So while we have a particular issue, you have 200, like I said, 20,000 people. It's already above that, but we have that recorded, who now have passports and citizenship of Russia in the eastern part, which means that they have voluntarily applied and agreed to annexing themselves.
That's what Russia does. They did it in Transnistria. They did it in South Odessa. This is what Russia does. You can't ship passports into an area and say, look, we sent a lot of people there, now we own it.
Just listen to what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Because it's not a defense. I don't think Putin's good. I'm saying there is a problem because it is not that there was just an issue and the Donbass region was independent. There was a military siege that has been going on, including shelling, which has led to many deaths in the region in the last 8 years from Western Ukraine to make sure that this region was not being self-governed. Now, you might say that that was good. Okay, fine.
The shelling came from both regions,
yes,
right? This has been, just to be clear, this was internationally investigated. There is no genocide going on of Western people shelling.
Genocide.
And I've seen the maps where people will say, like, well, the majority of the shells land in the eastern part. You can look at the maps of where these explosions happen, and 98% of them are directly on the border.
Destiny, I did not say genocide.
Sure,
I'm acknowledging deaths. I'm acknowledging an active conflict. This is an active conflict.
An active conflict.
Yes.
You also acknowledge that Russia has troops on the ground, not like arms, not secret people, but actual Russian military in the Donbass as well, right?
Yes, and I would say that the United States and NATO also always has advisors in every single country.
The United States and NATO do not have military presence in Ukraine anywhere.
I said advisors, not military. I said advisors.
Okay, sure, but again, equivocation. Advisors is a lot different than troops on the ground.
So let me explain. So again, I'm going here. So you have this issue. They believe that they are being unequally targeted. And of course, the munitions, would you say this at the very least, that some of the funding and the money that Western Ukraine is getting from the EU, getting from the United States, is coming from Western governments, and that we don't know exactly how it's being used, and many of which what we're understanding or what we're seeing probably was used to supply munitions that would break the Minsk II agreement, including a certain amount of distance that artillery could be fired. My point is that when you look at this, the people of Eastern Ukraine, the people who were there, do want independence from the West. They see themselves themselves as distinctly different people, a part of a federation. So my point of saying is that if the West really wanted there to be peace, why would they continue shelling? Why would they continue an active approach to this and not knowing or not realizing that eventually something like this was going to occur? And this is why I believe they're evil. I do, but I'm saying that. I believe
it's easy to understand why, because they don't want to just lose part of their country. Yes, the Minsk agreement was broken, but it was broken by both sides multiple times. There is no worldwide consensus.
Why would they not agree to neutrality? Why would they not agree to the draft?
Why would you want to agree to just lose part of your territory when a foreign country has already stolen part of your country, when Crimea has already been invaded and stolen by Russia? Why would you agree to just let go of more? And why do we only talk about the Minsk agreement? There are so many different agreements that have been broken. What about the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, where Ukraine agreed to give up all of their nuclear weapons in exchange for all of the world nuclear powers to not invade their country and steal shit, which is exactly what Russia did in 2014 when they invaded and stole Crimea, which is exactly what Russia did from 2014 to now when they invaded the East and they tried to break away 2 states, which is exactly what Russia did this year when they sent troops in and they've tried to take Kyiv and they've tried to take other parts of the country. Like, there are tons of agreements that have been broken, most of them on Russia's side. To keep pointing to the Minsk agreements over and over and over again when these things have been unilaterally broken by both sides because it's a separatist war, because it's really messy, and because Russia is sending actual troops and arms and soldiers to that part of the country to have the conflict go on indefinitely, like, yeah, of course, I wouldn't expect Ukraine to just say, okay, well, you know what, you win, we're just going to give up this part of our country now.
So that is a total recognition, specifically, you have to agree that the actual regime that is in there was duly elected. And the problem with this is, with Ukraine and its identity and what was going on, is that, yes, you go, why would they want to give up part of their land? Well, here's why I say Ukraine is evil, because ultimately speaking, people thought, and I know this genuinely, specifically looking at the amount of refugees that we have from Ukraine, that somehow Ukraine could be a NATO member. Now, there are many countries in Europe that are not actually NATO members at this point. It is shocking to me how many want to join now, but some countries have realized they need to stay neutral. This is even in world wars. You have, Switzerland, etc. Even now with Sweden, people are saying, hey, we've stayed neutral. We don't want to join NATO. We don't want to provoke anything. We're not joining that military alliance, getting involved in your global wars. We are staying independent. So the point is that Ukraine is in a position to where I believe through state media they were lied to in saying, hey, you can just become a partner of the West, and you can. This is why, again, I said I won't defend Putin, because I'm saying, look, the real situation is that this is sensitive. The situation is not that Ukraine has been solidified as a peaceful country that has a unified people that all believe and want the same things. Whether it's Western or Eastern propaganda, I believe there's lots of it. I don't believe anything that comes out of the Kremlin and, quite frankly, out of our own administration. But at the same time, when you look at this, you go, the idea of a presentation that this country can just be annexed or move itself when it's in an active conflict that is not even recognizing its own ceasefire is a disservice to its own people that is leading to unnecessary loss of life. And that, while you might say, well, he would have invaded anyway, or he would have, annexed the territory in Donbass, or he would have not, went any further into Mariupol, or even looked at the actual region. You go, okay, you can argue that, but at the same time, universally speaking, what a travesty it was to realize that there was an understanding of communication in the UN Security Council that this was the status, that if this happened and that the US tried to take them into NATO, which they're asking for membership, that they would invade. There would be warfare, and they wanted to avoid that, hence the 2 draft resolutions in 2021. And we knew this because BBC was reporting, I think in November, I remember, that there was the buildup of Russian troops already happening, and that Russia was very upset with the lack of acknowledgement and agreement of what was going on, a lack of further expansion of NATO. They were clear on what they wanted, and so what I'm saying is you kind of sound like you think I'm like, yeah, Putin's great, he's awesome. I'm going, the West and the East have used this now as a point of contention, of conflict between where their military power comes and goes.
I understand that you might not necessarily be defending Putin. The equivocation between joining NATO and Russia taking you over is just laughable, right? There's a saying in Eastern Europe. It's like, if you ask for the U.S. to come, the U.S. comes. If you ask for Russia to come, Russia comes. If you ask for nobody to come, Russia comes. This idea that Russia, and again, every single thing you're saying is framed through Russian interests, which I don't think supersedes Ukrainian interests. Russia does not have the right to invade a country just because they're worried that they might join NATO. And that's really it. It's not even that there's going to be an invasion. It's not even that there's going to be missiles launched into the Kremlin or into Moscow. It's just because, what? Because they think they have the right to run states that are next to them, because they're using this idea that they can just run shit is ridiculous. And even this idea that, well, there's a conflict going on in the region, so of course they can't join NATO. Like, again, that's the story of Georgia. In 2002, 2003, when they considered joining NATO, all of a sudden you had Russian peacekeepers moving into the south to help kind of these, separatist conflicts that were going on, until eventually they broke away states in 2008. And now that's the same thing you see in Ukraine as well. 2014, they steal Crimea, and guess what? Hey, can't join NATO because, oh, look, you've got a civil war in the east. They just got a whole lot harder for you. These are Kremlin talking points. The idea that, like, well, of course you can't join NATO. Look, we're hitting you right now over and over and over again.
See,
like, you got to wait till we win. Like, that's insane.
You said your worldview in the beginning that the state of the world, the security of the world is under this mutual or universal agreement of not invading. Unfortunately for the West and idealists and people who are pro-NATO, that is the assumption that all countries think like that. China does really technically not think like that, and they're amassing a military strength, and we're going to see what happens in the next, couple decades, especially with Taiwan. Not all countries do think like that. Many of them just have not had the military advantage to continue what they wanted. The USSR did not think like that. Look at what all the proxy wars happening in South America and in Central America. That's a very new understanding. We've had world wars in the last 100 years, so this idea that that's just universally accepted is more of a modern and a new idea. I am saying that we obviously wanted to think that Ukraine, and we told them that, like what you said, that's the lie. Yeah, why would you not just respect your own universal sovereignty and you can do what you want? Unfortunately, Russia doesn't play by those rules, which is why I can't defend them. But they have to understand and at least respect the fact that they are different and understand they do have a military, and as we're seeing today, they are willing to use it. And so we came in there with this understanding, like, well, Ukraine, you did have a fair election, even though your own country can't decide that it did. And there's clearly a line of division, in fact, a military line of division in your own nation of people who still disagree for 8 years. This isn't just a 6 months of disagreement or a January 6th worst insurrection in American history.
Zelensky is like one of the most popular presidents in Ukrainian history. The idea that some people disagree with the election doesn't mean that doesn't give you a right. There's people in the United States that don't agree with our election.
You know what? Someone stole my wife's purse out of her car and broke the window. I'm going to tell him, hey man, it's illegal. I'm under the universal truth that we don't break people's windows and steal their purse. Well, here's the deal.
If you want to go with that argument, that's perfectly fine. But now all you've given is a stronger argument for NATO expansion, which is exactly what we see. Now you've got countries historically that would have never joined NATO.
All you're doing is interrupting. Let me finish.
Well, because you're just saying a bunch without actually defending your point.
I can go walk around and find a dog off its leash and say, oh, well, there is some sort of a law inside of the park that says that all dogs have to be on your leash, but your dog was off it. People don't always play by the same rules. People don't always play by the same laws. The globe does not have a universal law. We don't even agree on a universal God. Not everybody's on the same side, which is why we have things like NATO. Why we have NATO? Because we have countries that we agree to do things a certain way, and other countries are not a part of it because they disagree, which is why they're called our enemies. The only thing falsely holding the world together in some way is the very, very, very thin smokescreen of universal global trade, which is keeping us all together through a mutual benefit. But militarily, we disagree. And I am telling you genuinely, the Ukrainian idea that we told Ukraine that the world plays like the West does, the world plays like NATO does. Unfortunately, do I agree that Western Ukraine has the right to join NATO, or they do have the right to break away, or they do have the right? Yes, they do. But to not have the people understand the consequences that, you know what, that's great, you do, you're going to have to be a refugee. You are going to have a war, because Russia, they do not mess around. They will invade. Well, that's not right, okay? I'm not arguing the moral relevancy or the moral equivalence of saying, is Russia morally good for invading? I won't defend that.
That's literally the point of the debate. This isn't a descriptive debate on whether or not Russia is invading. Of course they are. The name of the debate is Ukraine is evil. That is moral. That is a moral argument. So we're having a moral discussion on whether or not Russia should be able to invade. This idea that the world is held together through trade and nobody plays by rules, that's absolutely not true. And it's ahistorical. For the last 30 years, we've enjoyed more peace across Europe and the entire rest of the world than we have through all of human history. And a lot of that is because of all the international norms that we have set up, because of institutions like the United Nations, because of institutions like NATO. And when you try to say these things like, well, you know, Russia doesn't play by the rules, okay, fine. That's an even stronger reason for countries like Ukraine to join NATO. Because I bet that the Baltics, I bet that Romania, I bet that Hungary, I bet that these countries are looking at what's happening. They're going, you know what? I'm feeling pretty good being in Ukraine right now, or being in NATO right now, because I don't have to worry about Russia coming into my country and stealing my shit. So if we want to say that Russia is going to play hardball, they're going to play by these rules, that's fine. We can go that route. But now you've made an even stronger argument for NATO to aggressively expand as much as possible, because now we're going to have to play into the understanding that Russia is going to go in and mess with any country they can, save for countries that are in NATO, because they know they can't get away with it.
That's not actually true, because if you look at Lindsey Graham, Russia has reason to fear NATO expansion besides sovereignty, right? I mean,
why? Where?
Well, because Lindsey Graham, even when he was online, literally calling for the assassination of Putin, saying, I hope somebody goes and takes him out.
That's not, what is the threat of NATO to Russia?
Let me have a point. I'm saying, genuinely, there is a general understanding. The United States does see Russia as a threat. They are a threat in general. I don't think they're our greatest threat. I believe that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is a much greater existential threat in all cases. But Russia does pose pose a threat. In fact, we've talked nothing about Russia being the greatest threat, and there's even a disagreement in our own government on who is a greater threat, China or Russia. If you have a sitting member of Congress literally writing online about the U.S. interest, even if you say he acted rogue or alone, feeling emboldened to say about assassinating and taking out a world leader, yes, they have reason to believe that there is actually a threat of NATO moving and toppling the regime. I don't think we could sit here for one moment and think that we wouldn't want to see in the West Russia somehow being or Putin's regime being toppled, and somehow Russia ends up adopting some sort of a Western alliance or a Western military and trade alliance, becoming one less piece or one less threat.
Regardless of what we want, though, we respect that country as its thing. We are not actively trying to topple it. And even when they're involved in foreign affairs in other countries, we don't get directly involved. That's why Assad was able to hold on to Syria, because Putin decided to go down and help him out there. We didn't send troops in because we didn't want NATO troops firing on Russian troops. This idea that NATO represents a threat to Russia is just not true. It's fantastic. We can talk about Facebook posts or what people are tweeting, but NATO is not going to be invading Russia. NATO does not attack Russia, and NATO countries know that Russia doesn't attack NATO. This idea that there's like some threat to NATO, what is the threat? The threat that Russia can't just move in and start bullying countries around it? What is the threat?
So the threat is two things. So number one, when you look at Ukraine, like I mentioned earlier, they don't want this flat land, the actual land where you can move troops, the opportunity, the strategic point to actually move and have the ability to transfer large amounts of troops into Russia, or at least that's what they claim. And I'm taking them at face value.
Do we think that a war between the U.S. and Russia is going to be a ground invasion? Is that what do we really think?
I didn't claim it's going to be.
But I'm asking what the threats are.
Well, this is what I'm saying.
You're telling me what Putin is saying. I'm asking what you think. Obviously, Putin is going to say there are Nazis in there. I just want a real answer for once, for one of these questions.
Because I want to finish, because this is what you do.
Okay.
You interrupt people.
Because you're not saying anything.
Yes. So I'm saying, legitimately speaking. So they have the flat land that you move in. Number two, yes, we do not know, or they do not have understanding of what would happen if the West and if these Western alliances does create total and totality control along their border. They have now,
in the Baltics.
Listen, they have conceded. This is still conceding power. It is not. Maybe it's
not their power to concede. It's not their country. Nothing you're saying makes sense. Ukraine is not the country of Russia. They're not conceding.
So whose country is it? Is it the Eastern individuals or is it the Western? How do we solve the conflict? That's the important
I have an idea
factor.
how to solve the conflict. You let Ukraine choose. If they want to join NATO, they can join NATO. If they want to join the nation state that Putin is trying to build between Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, then they can join that.
And they can't decide themselves.
They absolutely can decide.
No, they are split.
They absolutely
right now
have been. That's why Zelensky has so much popularity. It's why they're fighting a war right now.
Yes.
And they're beating a country with 5 times active military members. It's because they're choosing to have their own country and to make their decisions.
One section of the land. There's a reason why they literally, you can look at the UN, you can see the line, the militarized line that is actually in their own country. How can a country that has its own militarized line between two regions who don't even see the election as being the same way? Yes, does the Western part have more power? Does it have more international respect? Yes. That is, of course, to be understood, as we've already seen in the revolution and what the interests of the West would be. But that does not mean that the country has solved its own issue. And so what we are doing is we are coming in with Russia, saying Russia's bad for trying to back the right's claim that they're the true and right leaders of Ukraine, and that's what Ukraine was. And we're saying, okay, Russia's bad, for that, and Russia's saying we're bad for backing the West.
It's equivocation again. Our backing is sending military aid or... Hello? Oh, it's sending aid or military aid or money. Their backing is troops on the ground or troops on the borders, shelling or invading the country. This is a huge equivocation between the type of support. If they were just sending in arms or whatever, it would be a different question. But Russia has active military operations going on in the Donbass. You cannot compare these two. And they've already invaded and annexed and stolen property, the whole Crimean Peninsula, not even just Sevastopol, but the entire peninsula from Ukraine. You can't equivocate between the actions of these two sides. And they did it because Ukraine turned their back on a exclusive Russian trade union. That's why they did it. To say that, like, oh, well, NATO's doing the same by using propaganda and trying to convince them to join European Union free trade agreements, that's the same thing as Russia literally going in and stealing your shit. I don't know how you can possibly equivocate between these two things.
So if the people in the eastern part don't feel like Russia's coming in and stealing their shit, but they're trying to end a war that he says he would end, and I don't know, he might be lying, but says, here's what we want, neutrality. I do not want another militarized country on our border of the West and what's going on. Even just today, I believe he was on report. I don't know, I got the kind of translation was pretty sketchy, but he actually said, hey, I don't want any other country intervening in this. We really just want the East, and we want it to be at peace, and we want the shelling to stop, and we want the military interactions and the engagement to cease.
Of course they want it at peace because they're trying to steal it from Ukraine. That would be like me going into your house.
Who decides that it's stolen?
That would be like me. We've decided in 1991 when Ukraine declared independence and they have internationally recognized borders. If I take a bunch of friends and I go into your garage and we start fighting for weeks about who owns your garage, and then somebody else comes in and says, can't you guys just be peaceful and I get to own your shit now? no, you wouldn't accept that.
That's not what happened. You're mischaracterizing it completely.
Okay, in 2014, did Russia send troops into the Donbass to assist with that separatist movement?
Yes.
Okay, was that part of the country part of Ukraine with internationally recognized borders since 1991?
So there's a country. Let me ask you this.
Come on, answer that.
Yes,
answer
yes,
that.
but I'm asking.
Okay,
so a country on your border, on your border is going through a revolution, which they can't agree on their own. No, they cannot agree.
They having internal strife or revolution does not give another country the right. We're looping. Does not give another country the right to come in and steal your shit.
Yes, we're almost arguing semantics. I'm saying
it's not semantics. It's paramount.
When the eastern part feels like they have been cooed by the West, they do not believe the election is fair, there is a country that acknowledges that we believe that the government that you believe is elected is the true and right government. Therefore, you're not going to follow what you believe is a fake and a puppet regime. So you are there, and so you have this line set across. You have lots of shelling, lots of things going on. They're saying, hey, we want to stabilize our border. Does a nation at a neighboring country that is having a revolution, that is having a military strategy where it could potentially bring conflict, that you already see there's actual conflict going on at your border, have international sovereignty and right to try to come in and stabilize to prevent conflict from coming further and reaching further into their land. Russia, in and of itself, didn't move too far west, and there still is a problem, and they did at some point, and we could argue the semantics if they really did pull out their military strategy. This is an issue that is so great, that is so mighty, that was going on there, that we never resolved it for the 8 years. So yes, am I, like I said, going to defend everything Putin did? No, with an understanding, though, that Western Ukraine and the way it's presented to the world is as if Ukraine is this unified country, and most people I've spoken to, at least, don't even know that there's been an ongoing civil war for 8 years, and they haven't even been able to solve internal conflict.
An ongoing civil war that's been backed by Russia. Of course it's been ongoing. Russia has
and
5 times the active military. No, where are the United States with troops on the ground in Ukraine?
We don't I'm not saying the troops are
okay, then don't say that it's backed by both. It's not. There's
money is important. It doesn't matter.
Money is not everything, though.
Yes, but money is important in war. Money is important in war. Right now, we're backing the Western Ukraine ideals, and we're giving them plenty of money. I think we just gave another $800 million package. That is important. Yes, we aren't putting troops. That would be a huge escalation. We know it's wrong. But I am saying,
wait, why would that be wrong?
Because it's not on our.
Why would that be wrong if the U.S. sent troops there? Why would that be wrong?
Why would it be wrong if we sent troops there? I don't believe there's any interest in our national interest to actually fight for Ukraine's sovereignty. I think this is an internal struggle that they have, a civil war that they need to solve.
Then why couldn't you just apply what you just said to Russia? This is an internal struggle that they have to solve. There's no business for Russia.
I didn't justify. Listen to me. I did not say. I said Ukraine is evil. The argument is not that Russia is good. The argument is that the entire conflict is misrepresented to the world as if there is a unified country. I'm repeating that.
Nobody is saying that. Obviously, there's.
I'm genuinely saying this. That has this desire. When they have an internal conflict, they have not solved. Russia is not a good country in general. I said that at the beginning. He's actually an authoritarian. Were his actions and what he's done in his life, even with annexation, was it illegal? Absolutely, international law. However, the problem is Russia does not play by Western rules, and the problem is we do have a conflict that Russia sees Eastern Ukraine as being the real Ukraine. They see themselves, at least internationally through propaganda, we're told, as Ukrainians. They were not given that acknowledgement, that understanding. That is a civil war. We are backing one side of the civil war. They are backing the other side. Are they backing it in ways that I think would be foolish? Absolutely. Do I think Russia should be there? That doesn't, my opinion as a 29-year-old guy in America doesn't matter.
If any European country had an issue where there was a civil war inside the country, Italy and Greece and France and Germany, any of these countries, and some other country decided to step in to guarantee peace, they said they were going to start breaking off regions of another country. Nobody would accept that. Everybody would look at them like they're insane. Nobody would say that you're allowed to step in. Again, like this whole conversation has been you accurately stating things that are going on, but are total non sequiturs for the justification of Russia invading Ukraine. There's a civil war. Yeah, of course, I acknowledge that. Like, there's conflict in Ukraine. Yeah, of course, I acknowledge that. There's a division between East Ukraine and West Ukraine. It's exaggerated heavily by the Kremlin, but I still acknowledge that exists, right? There are issues in Crimea.
I said in the beginning that I wasn't going to justify the actions of Putin.
I acknowledge every single thing you're saying. The descriptive facts are generally true, but none of that, not a single one of those facts, builds on Russia having provocation or justification for invading Ukraine.
So I don't think you understood my first statement, the fact that they have provocation.
Do you think
is it justified?
Does Russia have justification?
They do not have justification.
Oh, then what do we disagree on?
Because I'm saying that they have a reason that we did not respect, and that's why I said Ukraine is evil, the regime lying to its people, leading to a mass conflict, mass casualty, and of course
what is Ukraine lying to its people about?
Well, because it's this understanding that there could be an alliance. People called the bluff. Even I'll say, I don't know if anyone kind of got it wrong. When you heard that Russia was about to invade eastern Ukraine, it was like, really? Are you actually going to do a full military, even worse than 2014, full-scale invasion? I mean, from the left to the right, I think universally most people got it wrong. Even when put on defense, the Biden administration I don't know if you saw that one interaction with the reporter, with the guy from, I think he was from the Department of Defense, when he kept saying, like, we have evidence, and they kept getting asked, what's the evidence? And he couldn't provide the evidence. We're like, no, they're not going to do this. So I think militarily the government and the Biden administration was saying they were. I didn't think they were. I mean, saw like Hassan, even didn't know that he thought they were.
Okay, hold on. To be clear, the United States knew the invasion was going to happen.
That's what
we
I
declassified
said.
and we leaked a ton of stuff.
I literally just said that the administration said this.
Okay.
I'm saying the commentators, people were like, I don't know, it seems pretty fucking crazy. And it was, and it is. That's why I'm not here to justify Putin. I'm saying there was an actual understanding. He did bring troops, that's why we knew, and he had these resolutions that he wanted to bring this neutrality. Ukraine disagreed. There was this understanding that we could do that without war. And I believe the people were lied to. They were not given proper understanding or proper information that you can, and they have the right to fight for what they want. If they want to conquer the eastern Ukraine, if they want to push...
not conquer, but bring it back under the control of the country that rightfully owns it, right?
Yes, but whatever the...
When Elijah finishes his point, Destiny, you can respond, and we'll do closing statements and go to Q&A.
Okay, so do they have the right? Yes. When I say Ukraine is evil, I mean this. All the past aside, I think universally that the people of Ukraine are victims of a regime that did not work in a way that was in the best interest of the people. I think even the EU disagreed with how fast the United States was trying to accelerate and push Western Ukraine, or as you would say, all of Ukraine, into being an ally, possibly a neighbor state or a NATO state, at the threat and ignoring the threat that we knew was real of Russia. And therefore, Ukrainians are victims of another United States pushed and backed move to get a country to be our ally. And this is a war that I believe could have been avoided through UN Security Council. We could have done this diplomatically, and that's why I believe the current regime is evil. They did something that was avoidable, and they have put and plunged their country into something that could take decades to recover from. The lives that were lost will never be returned. And so yes, you can call Putin evil for invading. He was serious about it. We learned that. But Ukraine, by not acknowledging that and by lying to the world today and not being honest about the conflict through algorithm suppression, through our media, and not explaining the totality of what's going on, you're smart, so you know, but many people don't. I do believe Zelensky and that regime is evil, and they're painted as heroes when in reality I believe they're enemies of their own people.
Ukraine would have been invaded no matter what. This idea that it was the West's fault, that it was NATO's fault, the reality is, and I believe if you ask most people today, honestly, even if you ask Putin, he would tell you, if you take NATO or the EU membership wasn't even on the table. This is many years in the future. NATO membership, probably not on the table, many years in the future. If you take both of these off the table, the situation is probably largely unchanged. The reality was that Russia was stacking a lot of troops on the borders. Russia still owns Sevastopol and the entire Crimean Peninsula, and Russia had a huge interest in seeing that southeast region conquered, which Ukraine was slowly winning back because of foreign assistance. The reality was that Russia was probably always going to be invading, whether or not NATO or EU membership or EU trade agreements or anything was on the table. The reality that we can sit here and continue to talk about Ukraine through the framing of Russian desires or Russian wants or Russian moving in and peacefully settling a war that involves stripping away territories from Ukraine, I just think is a totally unfair way to view the country of Ukraine and to view the Ukrainian people. Whether or not a conflict in a country exists, which it does not give reason for another country to come in and start stealing territory.
Do you guys count those closing statements? That was good? All right.
It's like closing number 2. It's like 2 closing statements. So I'll conclude with this. I don't believe there's any moral or universal international defense for Putin in his current authoritarian state, both in the fact that he's not a failed regime, but I believe he is a mob leader who runs his country through force and suppression. We know they don't have any free speech, and even though what we've seen in Canada with Ottawa, et cetera, their suppression of political dissidents and killing of journalists shows that Putin has one thing in mind, which is his power. His propaganda in wanting to unite Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia into the Russian Federation and restore it may be a dream that is too far beyond understanding or realization, and may be in itself propaganda. But Ukraine is in a particular precarious situation because Ukraine is one of the last non-members of NATO, and it is not a direct member of the Russian Federation like Belarus is in direct partnership that allows it to be a strategic place and a point of contention between two rivaling empires. One would say the East having no chance against the West, and why we don't invade each other overall simply because I don't think anyone is really going to have a good time or win without mass casualty and mass expense. Ukraine is caught in the middle of this. There is a conflict that is going on, contentions back to 2014 that have not been resolved. Our media has unfairly lied to us, has not accurately represented the situation, and I do not believe that that election can be definitively decided as being fair and free, because if the people in the country cannot decide for themselves, and of course, unlike our idea in our election 2020, they're willing to fight a war over it and continue to shell each other, it shows that this is a problem that they must continue to fight themselves. I do not defend Russia's invasion of the Eastern parts. I do say that perhaps they might have asked, and that's an important question, did the Donbass region, did Donetsk and Lugansk, did they actually ask or want this? Well, that's important. Did they feel like they were being shelled and didn't have support, as the West has support from, through military, through money, and the might of the protection of surrounding NATO members? Perhaps. And you have to understand the work and the will of the people, including the terrorism that was taking place in the East. And I'll conclude with this. In the middle of this conflict, it is very important to understand that I personally respect and believe that until we find out what really happened, who's the right and the true leader, and the country can heal itself and find a way to unite itself, there is no true defense of which side is right or wrong. And while I do believe that Russia is incorrect in trying to actually push further, especially outside the self-declared independent regions, the US is escalating the war. And like I mentioned, the UK Secretary of Defense said that we are using American-made and UK-made weapons now to launch artillery and Javelin and Stinger missiles across borders into the Russian mainland, which is a high escalation of international warfare and shows that there is conflict beyond just protecting the sovereignty of Ukraine.
In 1991, Ukraine declared itself an independent republic from the Soviet Union. Nothing has changed. There is no reason to expect that any of these borders should be erased. There's no reason to expect that any sort of internal revolution, internal struggle, internal disagreement between the people would somehow erase the Ukrainian borders that the entire world had recognized. In 2014, Putin, upset that his guy had to flee the country after ordering his secret police to fire upon and kill protesters, just because he was so mad that his guy got ousted, Ukraine decided to look west for their economic future instead of east towards Russian enslavement, doesn't give him the right to move into that country and steal property like they did in Crimea, and it doesn't give them the right to militarily fund and support violent separatist movements in the East just to keep the country in a state of perpetual conflict so that they could never resolve their security disputes, so that they could never have a path forward to the EU, or so that they could never have a path forward towards NATO. A lot of people like to talk about hypothetical security concerns that Russia has, about hypothetical invasions from hypothetical armies and hypothetical future. It's all a bunch of bullshit. Like, the reality is that Ukraine has a very real security concern. They don't have hypothetical concerns. They have an actual Russian army that has already stolen territory from them, that continues to send active military personnel into the east of the country and now through the rest of the country to try to invade them. And I think that when we look at this issue, I think that we should look at it from a Ukrainian perspective and ask, what do the Ukrainian people have a right to do? The 2014 election, the interim government that happened after, and the actual elections that followed that aren't contested. Even the people in Ukraine don't contest these elections. They might want to have autonomous regions in the east like they did in Crimea for a long time, which they did under the Ukrainian government. They still had their own autonomous region, but that doesn't mean that they believe that those elections were rigged. Zelensky has enjoyed like some of the most popular support of any Ukrainian prime minister in the history of Ukraine. The idea that these elections are somehow widespread contested is just not true. And even if they were, we contest elections in different parts of the world, but that doesn't mean that we send people in to invade these countries because we don't like the outcome of some of the elections. You know, we'll condemn them, we'll tariff them, we'll embargo them, or whatever we do, but it doesn't mean that we have a right to go in and invade anything, although it seems like you agree with that regardless. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Let's give a round of applause for both our debaters here. And now we're going to do about 30 minutes of Q&A. Then there's going to be some final announcements that you need to stick around to at the end of it. But if you want to ask a question, we're going to form a line here on this aisle right here. And please specify who the question is for as well. Thank you.
First? Alrighty. So I would just like to preface this by saying that, Elijah, prior to this, I had never heard of you, Destiny, and I actually disagree with you on a lot of things. So which is why I want this statement to come from a place of neutrality and saying that, Elijah, I think you failed to make any real argument here. You have yet to answer the question why Ukraine is evil. You shifted the goalpost to should they be worrying about international alliances. At no point, I believe the word evil was used 3 or 4 times total in the debate, not once in your closing statement. All I'm asking is, how is Ukraine evil?
So number one, I didn't name the event, so that just going by the name of the event, Ukraine is evil. In fact, I've said online about Zelensky, I believe, and his regime being evil, but not the country itself. But I'm trying to play by the name of the actual point, which is why I'm trying to explain. I don't believe the people are evil. I don't believe the idea of a sovereign state is evil. But I do believe what is evil about this, playing off of the title itself and trying to be respectful to the group, is the fact that I believe the international community is being lied to about the contentions within the country. I believe it does a disservice to the people, as we're seeing with 8 million refugees, that I believe that if we moved in a direction, even the direction that Ukrainians wanted, which I respect their right to do so, that we thought that they could do so without a war, even if our own administration knew that it was going to happen. So I think that we've been sold this idea that there was like a bully, there was this peaceful state, that there was no division or contention, and Putin has just moved in and people are victims. But at the same time, it's something much deeper, much more complicated, and due to suppression of algorithms and agreements from people like Alphabet, even DuckDuckGo, TikTok, etc., suppressing Russian creators and news outlets and only allowing certain types of information to come out, has given us a very skewed perspective and an inaccurate perspective, and I believe it does a disservice to, once again, finding peace or some stability in the country, which I believe everyone there is entitled to. So I hope that answers your question. And again, if I had named the event, I probably would have chosen a different name, but I try to go with respecting the group and what they choose.
Can I just say that, like, do you believe what you're talking about here? Because I believe no one in this audience is convinced in the slightest.
That's totally fine,
Genuinely.
yes.
I'm not speaking out of, like, a place of hatred for you or your argument. I just mean, like, half of the things you just said, you didn't mention once. Algorithms, DuckDuckGo, TikTok, these are all just, you're coming up with that now in response to this. That's all.
Okay, well, I do believe it. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Okay, I'll try to keep this one quick. I just want to preface it by saying I hope you do more events in real life Destiny. I think like Twitch is a hellhole, and like what's it? I think it's better to actually like get out in the real world and like do this sort of stuff discourse-wise. But as far as my question goes, you've mentioned earlier that that your original take on NATO expansion, like years back, you felt that like it was a mistake and you regret it in that sense. Like as you've like come to like see more information, if I recall correctly. But my question is like, I guess the situation and like the discourse surrounding it, like exactly like what have you learned in the context of being both like a consumer of information and like someone who propagates information?
I think that being somebody that was pretty far left from probably like 2015 onwards, and I'm still pretty far left, I think it's very easy to, on all the populist fronts today, really, even Trump fans or Bernie fans or far left or far right people, it's very easy to just kind of have a foreign policy opinion that everything the U.S. does is bad, especially being, I'm 33, I was raised in the big Iraq war that lasted for like 20 years, in Afghanistan, kind of like failures of U.S. policy. And then when we think about like how the United States conducted itself during the Cold War, especially in places like South America, you kind of look to U.S. foreign policy and you're like, oh, the U.S. is horrible, it's evil, that's it. But I noticed that this is kind of the extent of the conversation. And the more that I argued with far left people that would kind of justify the actions of the Soviet regime, and the more that I would compare and contrast it to the United States, I would say, okay, the United States has definitely done pretty bad things, but the Soviet Union definitely did as well. This was definitely a two-sided conflict in the Cold War. It's not like the United States was the only player. And then when I kind of look at, I feel like there's a market, and I'll say this as somebody that sucks at history, and there are people that know more than me, but the feeling that I get is there's like a market change in the 90s and onward for kind of how the U.S. conducted foreign policy compared to prior to this. And when I look at like NATO operations in places like Bosnia, even in places like Libya, and I kind of look at the justifications for these. I look at the support or lack of support they get from the UN, or even places like China or Russia. I feel like broadly speaking, I can support the concept and the idea of NATO, and I can support broadly like the missions and the scope of the missions that they enact. And I think that NATO broadly represents something that increases the, I guess, like the security of Europe and kind of like the trust and confidence in the United States. And I think that that's something that's worth admiring and maybe even worth supporting, especially when I compare that to how Russia conducts itself with people along their borders.
So this question is for Elijah. You made a clear distinction that Ukraine has lacked the ability to form an identity. However, historically speaking, Ukraine has been exploited and torn apart by Russia and the West. If Russia was truly liberating the Russian/Ukrainian people, how do you explain Russian-Ukrainian factions unifying with other parts of Ukraine, where even the Russian Ukrainians are seeing Russia as the aggressor?
Great. Okay, so thank you for your question. So interestingly enough, I do not believe that Russia, like I said, is justified in what they're doing. I've said he's not justified. I think he was serious about what he was doing. I think the threat was minimized, I think to the point to where our own public did not understand what was going on. And I believe as long as the continued resolutions are ignored or the treaties, the war will continue to escalate. Is he right for what he's doing? No, I think people are seeing that this is going to be an increasingly very contentious and deadly and costly conflict. But I do believe, ultimately speaking, that we have to take one country and each country at its word, and as long as the resolutions are not acknowledged, as long as there's not a neutrality or a place of agreement that takes place, things will escalate. And with increased foreign aid, increased military aid from NATO, from the United States, and from, I'm not even entirely sure where all the money's coming from, because not everything's declared, but I know NATO's giving money on the EU as well. There is going to be an escalation to the point where this could be a greater and a larger conflict, and I do believe that ultimately, if something happens like this and things get to a point, people in the country could say enough is enough, not want the West or the East, want their own sovereignty, and again, unite together to fight. So I'm not against them doing what they want. That's my whole argument, is that I don't think Russia or the United States had the best interest of the country in mind. I think they both are using the country as a puppet state in terms of power grabs against each other and influence, and I believe the people themselves are not united and do not fully understand the direction they want to go by the distinction between the two Eastern and Western regions. So yes, I acknowledge that's true and people are doing that, and I wish them the best.
Destiny. How do you think that Obama would have handled Ukraine?
I have absolutely no idea.
May I hold that? No? Oh, okay, never mind. All right. So essentially I have one question. I guess this is more for Elijah, but Destiny, feel free to chime in on this. You had mentioned that Putin's primary motivation for the invasion of Ukraine was essentially like a prophylaxis because the Western world was pressing down on Russia, and the Russians got scared. My political beliefs have changed over my life, but ever since I was a child, I've thought NATO has been a waste of money. And the recent events have shown that NATO is essentially worthless and is not worth any of the money that's been paid for it for the better part of 30 years now. If I am just, a moron here before you, wouldn't Putin have also came to that same conclusion, especially since NATO has not really done anything to combat Russia's invasion?
So you're asking if he's come to the same conclusion that NATO's worthless, or what is the exact context? What's the actual question?
Ultimately, how can you say that NATO was the boogeyman that has been haunting the Russians for the last 30 years, when NATO has shown that it is completely impotent and essentially left Ukraine to Russian invasion uncontested?
Okay, so this could be complete propaganda, and again, like I said, I don't believe the Kremlin and what they're saying, but I have watched quite a few speeches from Putin talking about why he's justifying this war or even exceeding it. I know that in his own words, in his own administration, that they believe that Ukraine is a part of what he calls the Russian Federation with Belarus, that this is a united people that have their distinct culture. Do I believe that he really cares about these things? It's possible. Some people really do care about sovereignty. Some people really care about unity. Some people care about culture and uniting a group of people they feel is under siege from the West. And I know he has this idea, like I said, of individuals coming in from southern Poland, et cetera, and sort of creating this anti-Russian identity more in line with American idealism. So I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if Putin finds NATO to be useless. Maybe this attack on the East shows that he believes NATO's useless, and that's why he's doing what he's doing, because he feels emboldened. But I'm not entirely sure I believe anything coming out of that regime. All that I know is, again, my conclusion, he wasn't joking around, even to where I wasn't sure if he was going to invade, that he did not want NATO to have control of that country. Is that maybe, does he have hidden intentions? I can't know, I don't know, but ultimately speaking, he did stay true to his promise to have military intervention if there was a push. And with Zelensky even asking for membership and moving in that direction, it does appear that there is somewhat of a general agreement that Ukraine was moving in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think NATO is useless at all. I think that NATO is actually incredibly powerful. I think it explains Putin's actions to some extent. It's why he was so aggressive in Georgia, and it's why he was so aggressive in Ukraine. The reality is that if you're part of a NATO country, or if you're part of NATO membership, if your country's part of NATO, an Article 5 trigger is like a doomsday for anybody that decides to move in and mess with your country. I think that people would, to some extent, agree that NATO has been largely responsible, or at least has a large share of the responsibility of why the general security of Europe has been what it has been for the past 30 years, which is a lot more peaceful than than a lot of people thought it would be. A lot of people thought with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of people thought that this more unipolar world would result in all sorts of like localized conflict across all of Europe, and it didn't really happen. For the most part, I think that Europe has been a pretty peaceful place. Also, in terms of being impotent, I mean, like when NATO has a mission, NATO carries out the mission, and I think it's pretty effective in what it does.
Thank you very much.
My question is for Destiny. Elijah mentioned TikTok and algorithms and all that as far as Western support for Ukraine is concerned. Do you think that plays a part, if it's real at all, or does it not matter?
I'll let Elijah answer because I'm going to attack him, obviously. I disagree, obviously, with the way that he frames it. But I feel like there's a lot of equivocation that goes on when we talk about like different groups of people supporting Ukraine. Like, when we talk about like TikTok or we talk about like propaganda or whatever, like these are things that every country to some extent is going to participate in, but I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing. Like I would expect the United States to advocate for a Ukraine that is more pro-Western, you know, than not. That's just something I would expect. I'd expect Russia to advocate for Ukraine that is more pro-Eurasia or Eastern than not. But I don't think that to say that like, well, these guys are doing TikTok warfare and these guys are doing propaganda warfare, I don't think that that's the same as these guys are sending in troops on the ground to back separatists and to like prolong a civil war, or to send in troops and to steal land from a people, from a country. So yeah, I mean, I agree that there's going to be like propaganda warfare that's being played all over the world, and even more serious, there's cyber warfare that's going on between Iran, between Russia, between the United States and China, all over the world. These are things that are worth talking about, but I don't think that bundling all of these things together and pretending that they're all the same is an appropriate way to analyze the situation.
Thank you.
You can talk if you want, because I implicated. Okay, sure.
All right. This is a question for Elijah. This is kind of a follow-up to that first question about the title of the debate. You ultimately said that you're just hoping for stability in Ukraine. Can you explain how Russia, going into involving themselves in internal conflict with Ukraine, does anything to bolster any sense of stability in Ukraine or stability between Ukraine and Russian relations? There's a country under attack, people under attack, homes being burnt, people being bombed. How does that bolster any sense of stability? You have all these Ukrainian people that are going to feel as if Russia is attacking them and their families. Those tensions are going to build, and there's going to be more anti-Russian sentiment rather than neutral sentiment. As fighting continues in all the regions in the east, throughout the Sakon region, whatever it may be, there's going to be an anti-Russian agenda coming out of this ultimately. I want to get your perspective on how this bolsters security in the slightest.
Yeah, so I know I have an unpopular position because it's almost, you can't defend Putin, and I want to say the simple answer is it doesn't. I'm approaching the situation of where it is, not where ideally I would want it to be. I think of most of us, I put a joke one time in a recent bio of like, I'm now an Eastern European war expert, because it seems like in our country, depending on whatever the thing is, we suddenly support it and we all know about it, even though most people couldn't point out Ukraine on a map, probably even today. Ultimately speaking, no, it does not. Unfortunately, the way the world works is it's happening. And I think that you have to look at why it happened or why it occurred. Does it mean that Putin is good or right or somehow doing something to increase international peace? No, but saying, well, why did he feel like he had the national support, even if you argue against that, or he had the support of the people in the East to do what he's wanting? Well, obviously, this is a constant conflict of feeling they feel isolated, or at least they've said. And again, it's very hard as a Westerner for me to say many things, especially just to piggyback on the last comment. The genuine algorithmic problems with information have become so monumentally and colossally atrocious to me, because you can literally go into a search engine and type an exact phrase and it gives you the opposite, meaning like Ukrainian troops attacking Russian troops, prisoners, and it'll give you the flip. And no matter what, and you type in the flip and it doesn't give you the flip, so it constantly gives you like pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian information, which limits the amount of an ability I have to really get true and unadulterated information. And the same goes from Russia. I don't think Russia's putting out the most honest, fair, and free media, as you've seen. They don't really care about that. So the complicated question, or the complicated answer I would say to it, is we have to face with why it happened and why they felt isolated and why they accepted or allowed Russia to come in. with the understanding that they did. And so now that they're there, then the moral question comes that if Russia then moves any further than the eastern region, what justification do they have? And while I would say that even if they aren't justified in my eyes, strategically, internationally, or in their sovereignty, the claims that they make, they could not make any further sovereign claims, and they are limited simply by that. They are bound by their own limitation of saying that we are acknowledging a true republic that identifies out of what they believe is a faulty election. If they go any further and continue to take land or occupy land and not concede it back to the country, then I believe they're hypocrites, they're liars, and they're not acting on good faith. And that may happen. Since we're in an active warfare, I can't predict the future.
Thank you for your response. All right, my question is for Destiny and 2 points of context. Since '91, with the fall of communism, all but 3 of the Soviet or former Soviet republics have had skyrocketing Human Development Index. So let's take this as a proxy for quality of life. The 3 exceptions are obviously Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. This is a good argument for these people have suffered tyranny and violence at the hands of their states. So in 2014, so that's the first point. Second, in 2014, Igor Kolomoisky ran for president of Ukraine on a platform of let's expropriate and deport the Russians, if not more violence. He got 0.5% of the vote and was humiliated. He then financed the now Zelensky regime under his ownership of 1+1 media, spread propaganda against Russians, which probably flared some of the ethnic tensions we now see. Based on these 2 points, one can claim 2 things. First, the current regime in Kiev is evil. And second point, all of the previous regimes in the Ukraine, as well as the one in Belarus and Russia, are likewise evil for precisely the same reasons. They make the lives of their subjects, let's call them that, that's how they see it, worse. How are these regimes not evil, Destiny?
I think that control of media in Ukraine, I haven't gotten to dive into this in a conversation with anybody because it's one, not many people talk about it, and 2, it's a pretty complicated issue. I had a friend that was, I had a big debate with Fuentes on this, and we talked briefly about it, but there's like a huge history in Ukraine, I say history, but between like 91 and 2014, there have been a lot of different like oligarchs that control different radio stations that have been vying for getting their particular propaganda on the airwaves, supporting different factions. I've heard, for instance, that so people talk about how Ukraine is trying to push the Russian language out of, or the Ukrainian leadership is trying to push the Russian language out of a lot of Ukraine. And the reasons why I've heard for that is because, especially in places like in Crimea, there's a lot of Russian propaganda that's streamed across the radio waves in the Russian language. I've heard that in earlier regimes, part of the reasons why some of the far-right parties were able to get as strong as they were is because part of the regime leadership was trying to get those people to be more powerful via spreading propaganda on the radio in order to split the votes between other like opposition parties. I can't give you like a full breakdown, in-depth history on it because it's very complicated and because it just hasn't come up in a conversation, so I haven't studied that well. But I would say that if you're interested in propaganda that exists in Ukraine, there is like a very huge and rich history of different people like fighting like viciously over those airwaves to push, different propaganda in one direction or another. In terms of trying to answer your question, how does that make any particular party evil or good? I will say that we're a little bit spoiled in the West sometimes and that we don't have to think about it in necessarily the same framing. But when you're in a country where there are foreign powers that are leaning very heavily on your media, and when you have like strange oligarchs that exist in your country that are leaning very heavily on the media, it's hard to just come out and say like, you're evil for engaging in this type of propaganda when like everybody else does it too. I guess I say we're spoiled in the West, but arguably we would complain in the West that it happens here too, even ignoring Russia. People say, well, social media companies, Zuckerberg, or I guess now Elon Musk has too much power over the media. Are they evil for doing what they do? But I don't think that engaging in that level of propaganda would be enough for me to claim that a certain administration is evil or that prior administrations were evil.
That did not answer my question. The question was, considering the absolute state of these countries, while all of the former Soviet republics, their quality of life drastically improved. The case of the Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus being tyrannical as they have been, kleptocracies, if you will, this is evil, to steal people's earnings and to keep them poor artificially for the wealth of the ruling elite. That is evil. Or do you disagree with this, that stealing from people...
I mean, I think it's bad. I mean, I'm not going to defend like Ukraine one of the things that I referenced was a lot of the color revolution that was happening or a lot of the revolution that was happening in 2014. A lot of those protests, the Euromaidan protests, were because of massive corruption in Ukraine. I'm not going to defend that. I don't know if I would calling any administration evil is like, I don't even know if I would call Russia evil. But I mean, like, I'm not going to say that's a good thing. I guess if you were to push me on it, I guess I would say that it's evil. But yeah, I mean, my understanding is Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world pre-2014 and even afterwards. And I don't think anybody would argue with that. There's a lot of bad stuff going on in that country.
Can I just say this to add to that, though? That's why I didn't even want to bring up contentious points about people get lost in these arguments about Burisma and Hunter Biden and whatnot. I mean, people in governments and regimes using corrupt policies in places to enrich their pockets. I mean, I don't know if you saw Nancy Pelosi's response to ending it like, Congress trading. Why wouldn't we want to trade? Well, of course you would. You've gotten rich off the backs of the American people. You've robbed us. So, and that goes across both parties, even McCarthy, et cetera. So I'm not even, taking a one side. But yeah, I think the corruption, Ukraine is a hotbed of financial money laundering and a place of corruption, specifically because of the fact that it is neither, one side or the other. It makes a perfect hotbed for lots of problems, and it wasn't just because of the US or Russia. They've had a long-standing set of issues like most Eastern European countries have had, and Russia itself since the fall of the USSR.
Did you feel like I adequately answered your question?
I'm glad you agreed on the title of the debate.
Well, I'm not talking about like current...
Agree that it's evil. He claimed as well. Agreement. This is beautiful.
Okay. To say that there are like evil aspects of a country when you're talking about a conflict between two countries, you're trying to figure out like what is the right or wrong one, I don't think is the same as agreeing that there is prior corruption that exists in the country.
That was what was at stake.
So I'm going to push you on the Russia's evil comment. I'm very glad I had him right before him. This question is for Destiny. Recognizing that Ukraine and its territory from 1991 had oil reserves matching Russia's in the Siberian Peninsula. Knowing that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are some of the three poorest countries, at least in Eastern Europe, how is Russia not evil for stealing the region, specifically Crimea, taking these oil reserves, and starting this conflict just for that financial gain?
I'm very uncomfortable when we talk about like foreign affairs, like calling any particular side like good or evil. I think that it is a pretty one-dimensional way of looking at things. Like I'll talk about like, does somebody have like a moral right or justification or an international justification to do something? But like wholesale calling a country or an administration evil, I think is really, really difficult to do. Like maybe if we're talking about like, like Hitler or Mussolini, maybe we can go there. But even at that, I feel like just writing off like an entire body of something as like good or evil, I think is just too one-dimensional because there's so many systems involved.
Actually, I'm not from here, so I don't know a lot about politics. So this has been very educational for me. Actually, I have a question for both of you. So what are the difference or similarities you see between Ukraine and Russia and China and Taiwan?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is an interesting thing. So, number one, with Taiwan, I've been to Taiwan. It's a beautiful country. It's mostly buildings where I was in. I learned to use chopsticks there, so I'm grateful for that, right? I mean, that's a very, very, very strategic place. China obviously has a huge direction, their 100-year plan. They are under a very strict ruler, Xi Jinping, who has a very clear demarcation of where he wants the Chinese people to go. And he wants the one China, he wants to unify his people. This almost sounds similar in many ways to what Putin is saying with this idea of uniting Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia to get the Russian people that he sees as being united as one. You also see even right now with the sanctions, the move towards Putin becoming more, in some ways, an ally with China. I wouldn't say they're strategic allies. I would say that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the United States being very much against Russia in many ways and very much against China has backed them not only by borders, but the ability to make trade resolutions and agreements with the potential that conflict could ever increase. But specifically in terms of with Ukraine, I mean, this is very important to understand that with Taiwan, I don't believe that there is a civil war. I don't believe that there is a genuine conflict. And if there was a conflict, and I could be wrong, but if there was an internal conflict of whether they did not know and they were fighting a war of whether they wanted to be in control of mainland China or independent and under Western trade agreements, I feel like that would be a much different situation. A people in of itself having this, and of course, I'm not going to get into the details, knowing that coup could be backed by China or the United States, etc. But looking at the Ukraine situation, I do find it to be distinctly different, but it is interesting to see that it's the same propaganda, or if you don't believe it's propaganda, it's the same nationalist, patriotic ideas being pushed to justify the annexation of further land. So are they connected? I don't know, but universally, after the invasion of and the moving of Russian troops into the Donbass, it was interesting to see China come out with strong claims that one day Taiwan will be a part of China, and with the invasion of Taiwanese airspace, that there is that move of strength. And so who knows? And I think that would be a very scary and costly war simply out of the United States' determination to declare that they would defend, and they have said they would defend Taiwan's sovereignty. So that would be a conflict I hope none of you guys get to see, because maybe we'll see our next draft. Who knows?
I feel like the relationship between Hong Kong, Taiwan, China is more complicated, just because of like the longstanding agreements and treaties and how these like independent regions are administering to themselves versus Ukraine and Russia, which I feel like is a lot more clear cut. Ukraine is distinctly independent. It's not like a region that's administered by China. It's not its independent but kind of dependent thing that's on its way back after some number of years. I feel like the Ukrainian conflict between Ukraine and Russia is way more clear cut. I couldn't say the same for Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. I feel like those are going to be more complicated in the future.
My question would be for Elijah. During the debate, you seemingly at multiple points called into question the legitimacy of the Kiev government as it being a Western puppet state. Meanwhile, the Eastern autonomous regions currently have Russian troops in them. How is it that you seemingly completely take for a fact that these Eastern states are completely legitimate and aren't just simply going which way the Kremlin does because they have a boot on their throat?
So I don't. Simply stated, I think that the fact that it has not been resolved internally and it's still an open conflict, I don't think anyone in this room has as much information today as they do about Ukraine and the conflict that they probably had just back in January of this year, because it was of intense interest since 2014, 2015. It has not been a massive discussion, other than, of course, the quid pro quo and, we're talking about with Hunter Biden, corruption and money, the military strategy and the differentiation between the independence of certain regions backed by them. No, I do not know who legitimately is involved, because like I mentioned, I can't defend Putin because it looks like both countries were trying to influence the election. And I'm saying that I'm not coming in and saying that it was an unfair election or that it was corrupt. I'm saying they are. And since they haven't resolved it, I do not know. So I'm neither defending either. I'm saying this is a genuine situation where you have to let the people fight it out. And that's what it looks like to me. But of course, I do want to say this absolutely. I do call into question the entire presidency and why I feel like Ukraine is, I'm not going to say they are evil, but why the regime should be called into question when there's a regime that is being voted in, whether or not it's backed by a country or backed by another set of alliances and countries. Seems so strange to be such a distinctly sovereign country whose elections are determined by which international alliance or country or federation backs the certain regime. It's a very questionable authority, and I think the election should be looked at again.
I think I'm done.
Okay.
So for both of you, regarding your discussion around the future state of affairs regarding foreign policy of every other nation in the world, because Russia is basically, as you said, breaking the rules of the West, what do you think is going to be the potential outlook for the future of third world nations that could just be ruled over by Russia? Or do you think that NATO is going to expand rapidly enough that maybe we'll stop it?
I'm going to be honest, I have no idea. I don't know what people think is going to happen in the future. I've heard all sorts of crazy things floated around that maybe Russia will invade a NATO country and think that nothing is going to happen, or maybe the Ukrainian conflict will die down and nothing will change, or I don't know. I couldn't possibly predict that. We still don't even know necessarily how the Ukrainian conflict is going to settle out. If Ukraine is going to be able to push back and take over the parts of the Donbass that have been lost, or if they're going to go back to Crimea and fight there, or if they're going to push into Russia at all. Like, who knows? Like, I wouldn't even try to make that prediction. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I can't make the prediction either, but I will say if Russia goes beyond what they've already stated was their military advantage or why they actually invaded and what the purpose was, then they have no credibility and they have absolutely no respect on the international stage because they can't be trusted. And so, well, time will tell and we'll see, and I hope they're not stupid enough to cause an international conflict.
Sorry, I meant to premise that with Ukraine losing this war eventually, which is kind of looking like, but we'll see. But yeah,
I mean, I think if Ukraine, I think Russia would like to have. I think they call it the Union State. The idea that you have like Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine all kind of together working in this economic union, this like Eurasian power. I don't think that they would like keep pushing west if they were to win and like have some sort of like Belarusian regime in Ukraine. I don't think they'd keep pushing. But I would be very cautious when I say that because who knows? Like post the Ukrainian invasion, again, this is like. I don't know how long it's been since another country has invaded a country to steal territory. It's something we haven't done in like over 30 years. We haven't seen something like this happen. So I don't know what the situation is going to look like afterwards.
Yeah, and I would just say they would be very foolish because they're spending $20 billion a day, it's estimated, in terms of overall cost to wage this war. I don't see with the sanctions and the strength of the actual economy. If you even look at on the developmental country scale on like 0 to 1, I think they were like a 0.74 or something, which makes them like a second world country. So while they do have, like technically in terms of development, they've had some issues and they are rising out of the ashes of the USSR. I don't believe they have the ability to wage a further war outside of there. The Russian propaganda says they don't have any desire, but like you said, I mean, they could do anything because the world is unpredictable, and we'll wait and see.
Fair enough. Thanks.
So for both of you, with more and more of the reports of like war crimes coming out from the Russian military within Ukraine, certain heads of state have come out and said that Russia is engaging in genocide. Would you guys agree that Russia is committing genocide, or is it too early to say yet?
I like to refer to genocide strictly in the legal sense. So if it like rises to what would be considered a genocide, then maybe. I don't know if war crimes are always necessarily considered genocidal or not. Kind of like peripheral to this, one thing that's a little bit scary is it seems like we've kind of brought down the hammer on Russia almost in as many ways as we can. And if Russia truly is successful in breaking off completely from relying on Western trade, and they have their own kind of, like Asian agreements and agreements with China, and they're able to sell their oil and everything as well as they can, I don't know if there's much we can do to Russia at that point. Like, say they did genocide people or say they did commit war crimes, which it seems like at this point it's pretty undeniable. I don't know like what's left for us to do at that point. Like, I don't know what sanctions we could place on them or, what kind of harm. We're never invading or bombing them or doing anything like that, so.
And I would say no one likes to exaggerate more than Trump in any situation, and he's obviously calling this genocide. I do concede the notion that there are war crimes happening, absolutely, and it is really, really tragic to see what's happening in some of these cities, especially people that chose not to be refugees, chose not to leave. And I think there will have to be international courts that will take place and will actually acknowledge what happens when the conflict ends, depending on what actually happens within the nation. But like Destiny said, if they do proceed and win this war, and after removing, as we saw today, I believe Russia cut off gas to Bulgaria and to Poland. It's so funny how I see the article that they are bullying the nations by their sanctions against them, but when we do it to them, it's about democracy and freedom. And so I think we're seeing an iron curtain possibly, or I hope not, rise again between the East and the West. And this may, like if it rises, just like we saw through the conflict of many, many decades in the 90s, you saw the 90s, 80s, 70s, etc., in the end, they may be able to do what they want. And the atrocities of the USSR, I mean, are just innumerable. And they're horrifying what has actually happened. And so, God forbid we get to that point, and let's hope it doesn't get there.
All right, thank you.
Hello, I have a question for you, Elijah. If you acknowledge the extensive evidence that the separatist groups have strong Russian ties and are strongly being influenced by the Russian administration, why do you frame the group as being more of a independent separatist group with genuine interests for independence rather than more of a proxy army for the Russian administration's interests?
Yeah, so I'm not a foreign relations expert, and so I'm going by draft agreements that happened from 2014 on just what was acknowledged or what was actually recognized, universally with Europe and the EU, and kind of saying you are self-governing. I don't believe that those draft agreements were conclusive. I don't think that they were actually quite helpful besides perhaps creating an overall greater ceasefire. And so I am not one to even, my opinion wouldn't matter if I want to respect them as a genuine group or just as a militia-backed group, but maybe it was the failure of the international community to not push harder and to, out of desperation, find some sort of a peace agreement out of you know, political advantage. I don't know why they didn't push, but seeing the way that France and Germany acted in the UN Security Council a week before Russia invaded, almost saying like, I don't know, we're not even going to acknowledge this. I don't believe the international community does recognize the eastern part as a legitimate government, even if the agreements say so, and I don't believe that Ukraine does, based on their own admission by the ambassador during that hearing, and so that's, my opinion would be negligible here. I don't believe, I'll just say this, I don't believe currently that the Western world, NATO, including the United States, actually views the eastern part of Ukraine as being a legitimate independent state, and I think Russia does. So that's where I believe a lot of the conflict is.
But it seemed like from your argument that part of Ukraine being evil was that they weren't recognizing the independence of this state?
So again, I didn't make the title. I mean, it's a great title to get people to come and get your posters ripped down. Ultimately speaking, and I try to work within the parameters of any type of discussion, I believed that the regime was evil. I believe that the war was misrepresented, the conflict was misrepresented, and I believe that the West is being lied to, the populace, like through the algorithms, etc. We are suppressing the truth about what's going on. Do I really believe in the East or the West claim to the country? That's what I'm saying. I'm not here to decide the conflict of the Civil War, but ultimately speaking, I know that we are just in a situation to where the East declares himself independent and sees the West as being illegitimate and the people who are under the control of a failed election and vice versa. So it is a civil war, it is a conflict, it is ongoing. And again, like I said, I don't justify Putin because yes, this is a high escalation and only time will tell if his ultimate goal was to recognize a country for independence, but his track record, Putin doesn't have exactly a very good honesty record with the global stage. So we will have to see in the coming weeks, months, and years, and I hope the conflict comes to an end soon.
So I'll start by saying I've been an SOB, a slightly offensive backer, for 2 years now. My question is for Destiny. We understand that there is a civil war going on in a failing country. NATO wants the West to be part of their alliance, and Russia wants that geological bumper state. We all agree we want the least deaths possible, so how is it evil for Russia to aid a large group of arguably their people who are essentially at risk of Western bombing at any second?
I'm going to answer quickly because he told me to get out of here. No. I mean, I think Ukraine has their borders. I don't think that a group inside Ukraine wanting separatism is enough to violate those borders. It's as simple as that.
Thank you.
Hi, this question's for Elijah. So I actually agree with a lot of your political views and on your show and otherwise on the slightly offensive show as the previous previous questioner asked. But this is more to like the other points you made in the debate. Like you said earlier in the debate that Ukraine has a right, hypothetically, to join NATO if it wants to as an independent country, and that also that Russia is kind of playing by a different rule book, which obviously it is in terms of what it's actually doing. But at the same time, it's not like Russia is not subscribing to the rules that you can't conquer other parts of a country. Like, for example, Russia recently just condemned Israel's supposed occupation of the so-called Palestinian territories. So obviously they do consider some sort of idea of national sovereignty and national borders important. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, how is the Ukrainian government evil necessarily? And obviously they're evil, perhaps evil for other reasons like corruption or various other reasons, but how is they evil for specifically for what, like, even hypothetically entertaining NATO or hypothetically entertaining, you know, Western powers, so to speak?
Yeah, so we have to keep this really short. They're not evil for entertaining, I believe, the way this was represented to their people, that this could happen, that this was something that could just be done, not realizing that there is no end to a war that was active, there was a ceasefire, and that there was going to be escalation. And I don't know if the people in the country, knowing they were going to have to flee and there was a guaranteed military incursion, would have been so friendly and made such an open understanding and trade deals, etc., and had a national populist understanding they wanted to join NATO or join, I don't really think the EU as of right now wanted to move closer to the West, might have had that same thought, knowing what they would have undergone as a country. And so I believe it was misrepresented, it still is being represented, and I feel like that propaganda war is really what's the most evil part about it, and my heart hurts for the Ukrainians who are currently in the position of having to leave their homes. I wish that on no one.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to waste any more of your guys' time, but
thank you.
My question is for Destiny. Do you believe that the Ukraine conflict will end before you're unbanned on Twitch?
I have no idea. Good question.
This question's for Steven. How many pair of pants do you own?
I actually, when I find a shirt or a pair of pants that I like, I actually buy like 5 or 10 of them. I'm like a video game character or like a cartoon character. You go upstairs to my suitcase right now, I have 4 more pairs of these exact same sweatpants, so.
All right, thank you.
I guess I'm the last one, so I'll begin by thanking you both. Elijah, I'm still trying to understand exactly what your main thesis is. So you're against the coverage of Ukraine because you believe that the Ukrainian government is corrupt and not serving the best interests of its people, correct?
So do you want the thesis, or do you want me to answer question by question?
Well,
just wondering.
The question, sorry.
Okay, so my thesis would be very simple. The idea that Ukraine is a sovereign nation that suddenly has decided an election and is being invaded by a foreign country is not the correct narrative, and I believe that that misrepresentation to its people that it was a sovereign nation that could join NATO and the West without the real threat and the invasion of a foreign country is the greatest travesty here, and I believe that the 2014 election, he would disagree with me, clearly has not been fully decided or acknowledged by all parties, and that active conflict that ended in a ceasefire that has not really been acknowledged or even respected by both sides was something that really should have been broadcasted, put into play, and presented to the people and to the world before there was this national global push for Ukraine to become a part of the West. And so my genuine idea of what it is evil is that it's been mischaracterized, misrepresented, and this is not a new war. This is a continuation of a civil war. I don't believe it's just separatists who have not agreed to decide on the results of the 2014 election based upon the interests of 2 different regimes, the East and the West, Russian Federation, and the EU-backed NATO. So.
But, I mean, we need clear evidence and validation that that election was, in fact, fraudulent. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter what the separatists think if the Ukrainian government in power now is legitimate, correct? Because, in every country, we can go around the world and find there'll be a large group of people that disagree with the regime in charge. But that doesn't give any sort of civil war any legitimacy.
Yeah, so this was not a normal election, which is important, and I'm just going to wrap it up by saying that it's like he even used the phrase, which I would pair it would be revolution. This is an idea of regime change based upon who's backing the country, all the way down to trade resolution. This was not a normal election. This was almost like a war. This actually would be considered a wartime election with travesties happening. I believe over 100 people were shot and killed by police. It does not make the previous administration or regime better, and I think it's actually key to not call it administration but regime. This was regime change in a nation, which goes everything with that, and so I don't believe that the regime change is respected by one side, even if perhaps you might say it was a fair election. I don't think I can fully audit it, and I don't know if there's agreements that it's been audited fully and thoroughly, depending on who you ask, but a country may still have a problem of saying we don't want to change regimes, and that's not just separatists of a Democrat state breaking away from a Republican state, etc. This is the idea of which country, which alliance are we going towards as a nation, and what's our identity as a people, and I think it's a fundamentally much more complex issue.
No, I would just conclude by saying, my perspective on it is, I think no one is disagreeing with you that there is a lot of corruption and malpractice going on in the governance of Ukraine, and that has been there for a long period of time. But that being said, I still think it should be fairly straightforward to pick which side of this war to support and be pro-Ukrainian. But also acknowledge what you're saying, and that the governance of that country needs to be cleaned up going forward. But we can both say that and say we're totally against what Putin and Russia are doing at the moment.
I just think American imperialism forces us to choose a side, and I choose neither.
Just one more thing. I mean, could you not pick a side and then also say, but my side has some work to do on its own end?
I'm not interested in the civil wars of nations that I don't believe are in our national interests. So I'm disinterested, to be genuinely honest.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the great questions. Now, like I said, we just have a few quick little announcements before we go. I want to start off with, firstly, that we are celebrating our first ever completed year as a new organization because of, as you know, COVID sidetracked everything, and we have technically been around for 2 years, actually, because we started in 2020, but when I was talking to Penn State about doing the Milo event, they said, well, of course it's going to happen unless something crazy like the governor shuts down our state and there's a national emergency. But that's never happened in 30 years. And then guess what happened? All of that. So we've been still working through our organization, building it. Like I said, we're now at University of Tennessee. And we've now done our first ever debate. So it's been a wonderful year, and I thank everybody for coming out. Very nice of you guys. And specifically, I would love to thank our speakers this year, Mario Yiannopoulos, Elijah Schaffer, and Steve Bunnell, aka Destiny, have all been wonderful, great to work with, great people. So I'm very happy that we got them all here, and they've been wonderful to work with. As long as we have an exec board and people to make up the club, this wouldn't have happened. So I'd like to thank our exec board. I won't name their names, but for their own safety, but they've been amazing, because honestly, doing something like this is hard. Standing for free speech is hard today, especially when it's controversial or socially unacceptable. And they were the only 2-3 people willing to do what we want to do. So it's amazing that they were able to do that. And of course, I'd like to thank our volunteers, campus security, and all the generous donations. Everybody that paid for tickets last time and this time, your generous donations have been used to cover all these event costs, and we literally couldn't do this without you guys. So thank you so much for that. And everybody that's worked with us, Josiah, Elijah's intern, has been wonderful, and Sam Pletcher, who supplied all the waters, and all of our friends at Penn State and Church Militant, Milo's team that have helped us throughout all this have been so amazing in helping making all this happen. So like I said, we literally couldn't do it without these people. And specifically this time, we had a live stream, which I never thought we could do, because I thought it was going to be too hard, too complicated. But Jeff and Wise Guy Productions came in and said, we'll do it. And as you can see, it's the full thing. It's amazing. So if anybody wants to check out a replay, we'll have some on our channel and also on Destiny's channel as well. And you can see it. So thank you guys for streaming this. It's been amazing, and we really appreciate it. But I also want to thank everybody who has disavowed us. We couldn't have done it without Students Against Sexist Violence, the Free Speech Warriors at the College Republicans, the College Democrats, and Lion Pride, Queer and Trans People of Color, Black Caucus, Asian Pacific, Islander, Desi American Caucus, the long one, Latino Caucus, Empowering Women in Law, Triota House Society, Planned Parenthood, Gender Equity Center, Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, Opulence, PRCC, UPUA, Penn State themselves, and our own senator, Bob Casey, disavowed us. So our organization was disavowed by everybody. And it shows what we're doing is actually having an impact, and that people are starting to listen, even if they disagree. But as you know, we have a lot of people here who agree and disagree for everything. So can't call us partisan, I guess, if both College Democrats and College Republicans disavowed us. But if you want to find out more about Elijah and Destiny, who have awesome shows and awesome streams, scan the QR code, bring you right to our site where you can see all of our stuff and their stuff as well. I highly recommend everybody follow them on all social media channels before they get banned on the mainstream ones. So please give them a follow. And if anything that I want to last say that really sums up what we're doing more than anything is a friend of mine who, if he wants to come up, he can. I don't want to out him. But because of his simple question to Thon, he asked them, do you defend free speech, when they disavowed the Milo event? He was removed from his fraternity's Thon board for that, for just asking a simple question. But as you can see, we had Q&A here. People could ask questions, and we're all fine. That is exactly what is wrong right now, is the fact that you can't ask questions, you can't have an open, honest dialogue. I mean, how many times did you hear people say, well, I think this, or I don't know about this? That's an honest dialogue where you acknowledge the things you know, the things you don't know, and are still able to talk to each other, even if you disagree. So when I heard that story of him, I mean, it was just sad to see that this is where we are now, but it shows that what we're doing is more necessary than ever before to actually promote and do free speech rather than just saying you stand for it, like other organizations. And if you're a backstage or royalty ticket holder, please stay here. We're going to do a quick meet and greet, and please make it quick because we do got to get out here before we get kicked out. If you're a royalty ticket holder, please come up to me, and I can tell you the dinner location, and we'll do that afterwards as well. Thank you everybody so much for attending. It's been a wonderful year, and we hope to see you guys back next year.